We're at that order of business of signing enrolled acts again. The first enrolled act for our consideration is House Enrolled Act number 67. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
House Enrolled Act number 67, being original House Bill 199, an act relating to motor vehicles, providing for a decal designated breast cancer awareness to attach to the license plate, providing for a decal fee, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign House Enrolled Act number 67, being original House Bill 199. I have so signed. Congratulations, Representative Conrad. The next enrolled act for our consideration is House Enrolled Act number 68. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
House Enrolled Act number 68, being original House Bill 140, an act relating to health insurance, specifying reimbursement requirements for mental health and substance use disorder benefits as specified, providing definitions, requiring rulemaking, specifying applicability, and providing for an effective dates, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign House Enrolled Act number 68, being original House Bill number 140. I have so signed. Congratulations, Representative Zwanitzer Dan. The next enrolled act for our consideration is House Enrolled Act number 69. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
House Enrolled Act number 69, being original House Bill 128, an act relating to crimes and offenses, specifying that the offense of voyeurism may be committed by looking within an area where the person being viewed has a reasonable expectation of privacy, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign House Enrolled Act number 69, being original House Bill number 128. I have so signed. Congratulations, Representative Clouston. Any messages from the Senate? Why don't we do a few messages from the Senate?
Message 413. Mr. Speaker, Senate File 32, prohibiting drones over penal institutions. The Senate failed to concur on House amendments to the bill listed above by the vote indicated. Ayes 31. Message 414. Mr. Speaker, the Senate did concur on House amendments to the bill listed below by the vote indicated. Senate File 123, military dependents, school choice. Ayes 30, noes 1. Message 416. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 128, voyeurism within enclosed spaces. Ayes 31. Message 417. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 140, mental health care access collaborative care model. Ayes 22, noes 9. Message 418. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 199, license plate decal, breast cancer awareness. Ayes 22, noes 9. Message 419. Mr. Speaker, Senate File 61, legislator per diem. The Senate adopted the Joint Conference Committee number 1 report on the bill listed above by the vote indicated. Ayes 19, noes 12. Message 424, Mr. Speaker, the Senate appointed Senate conferees to meet with the Like Committee number 1 from the House on amendments to House Bill 64. The Senate conferees are Senator Hicks, Chairman, Senator Eide, Senator Kinski. Message 425, Mr. Speaker, the Senate appointed Senate conferees to meet with the Like Committee number 1 from the House on amendments to House Bill 33. The Senate conferees are Senator Scott, Chairman, Senator Ellis, Senator Hicks. Message 426. Mr. Speaker, the Senate appointed Senate conferees to meet with Elect Committee Number 1 from the House on amendments to House Bill 195. The Senate conferees are Senator Kinski, Chairman, Senator Garou, Senator Kolb. Message 415. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 2, Town Officers Salary Waiver. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 24, noes 7. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 423. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 99, Property Tax Refund Program. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 18, noes 13. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 427. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 103, Political Party Affiliation Declaration and Changes. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 19, noes 11, excused 1. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Sincerely, Ellen Thompson, Senate Chief Clerk.
We are back at that order of business of signing enrolled acts. I'll do a few more way. The rest of the, it looks like we're getting close to a full body now. We were pretty short. Just so the body knows, we kind of have to keep up with these enrolled acts because the clock starts ticking on vetoes and that sort of thing. And so we want to make sure we have the ability to react to anything that our good chief executive might do that we didn't particularly like. So we try to keep up with our paperwork. Thank you, Chief. The next enrolled act, we are at that order of business of signing of enrolled acts. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act number 57. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act number 57 being original Senate File 140, an act relating to public health and safety, providing for the use of alternative refrigerants as specified, providing for regulations as specified, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act number 57 being original Senate File number 140. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act number 58. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act 58 being original Senate File 52, an act relating to school finance, modifying the distribution of funds for K through 12 public school special education services, repealing a provision and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I'm about to sign Senate Enrolled Act number 58 being original Senate File number 52. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act number 59. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act 59 being original Senate File 53, an act relating to Defense Forces and Affairs, specifying that a Wyoming National Guard member serving in the state active duty may be reimbursed as specified for medical insurance premiums, providing for an appropriation and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act number 59 being original Senate File number 53. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 60. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 60, being original Senate File 56. An act relating to game and fish, expanding the prohibition for entering private property without permission for hunting purposes, and also prohibit traveling through the private property and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 60, being original Senate File Number 56. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 61. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act 61, being original Senate File 67. An act relating to motor vehicles, allowing a person with a disability to be issued a special license plate with a disabled designation for a multi-purpose vehicle, specifying that a distinctive symbol may be used on a disabled license plate to designate vehicle type, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 61, being original Senate File Number 67. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 62. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 62, being original Senate File 98. An act relating to education, authorizing the award of a certificate of completion for students with disabilities as identified under the Federal Individuals with Disability Education Act as specified, requiring rulemaking, requiring reporting, making conforming amendments, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 62, being original Senate File Number 98. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 63. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 63, being original Senate File 113. An act relating to professions and occupations, amending the qualifications of persons applying to become a licensed architect or landscape architect, amending the requirement that architects be notified of pending license expirations, authorizing the Board of Architecture to use the annual renewal fees to offer continuing education programs as specified, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 63, being original Senate File Number 113. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 64. The
Senate
reading
Enro-
clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 64, being original Senate File 128, an act relating to state lands, removing the requirement that state and federal lands be equal in the size when exchanged by the state and the federal government, requiring that federal and state land exchanges be subject to the orders, rules, and regulations related to the exchange of lands, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 64, being original Senate File Number 128. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 65. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 65, being original Senate File 157, an act relating to weed and pest control, clarifying that the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho tribes may apply for participation in specified emergency insect management programs, requiring coordination with weed and pest control districts for emergency programs, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 65, being original Senate File Number 157. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 66. The reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 66, being original Senate File 123, an act relating to education, allowing children of active duty military members to transfer to any public school within a school district as specified, requiring reporting, making a conforming amendment, and providing for an effective date, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act Number 66, being original Senate File Number 123. I have so signed. The next enrolled act for our consideration is Senate Enrolled Act Number 67. The Reading clerk will read the enrolled act.
Senate Enrolled Act Number 67, being original Senate File 32, an act relating to crimes and offenses, prohibiting the use of unmanned aircraft systems as specified, authorizing the Department of Corrections to take reasonable action against unmanned aircraft systems trespassing over or in penal institutions, providing definitions, providing penalties, providing exceptions, requiring rulemaking, and providing for an effective dates, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
I am about to sign Senate Enrolled Act number 67, being original Senate file number 32. I have so signed. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House resolve itself into committee of the whole.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. Motion carries. Representative Zwanitzer Dave.
The Committee of the Whole will please come to order. The first bill for our consideration is Senate Joint Resolution Number 5. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate Joint Resolution 5, original sponsor by Senator Boner. Air Force 75th Anniversary, a joint resolution to recognize and congratulate the United States Air Force on the 75th anniversary of its founding. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 8, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs, to whom is referred Senate Joint Resolution 5 engrossed, Air Force 75th Anniversary, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Berger, Brown, Nemec, Obermueller, O'Hearn, Pendergraft, Smith, Stivar, Wiley. Representative O'Hearn, Vice Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rise to report it, do so with the recommendation that Senate Joint Resolution 5 do pass. And I further move the explanation of the joint resolution to our freshman senator from the middle of the state.
Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to basically present the Senate Joint Resolution 5. And as you guys all heard, this is a joint resolution to recognize and congratulate the United States Air Force on the 75th anniversary of its founding. And it's kind of interesting. I'm going to kind of talk through this bill and maybe talk a little bit about the Air Force and the relationship to the state. Being an Air Force guy, it's kind of funny. You sort of took it for granted growing up on the east side of the state and knowing this well and knowing the Air Force Base is right here. Of course, it was right down the road. I just lived 70 miles to the north of here. But it was always interesting, you know, being out plinking as a young man in the area. You know, you'd go out plinking and you'd always see a missile area, or in some cases, every once in a while, you'd trip over a little I think they still refer to them as capsules, where there'd be a small group of men associated with the Air Force Base, F.E. Warren. And we always referred to them as capsules, but they'd be out in the middle of nowhere. Those guys would be out there doing their duty. Anyway, very interesting, but it was kind of fun reading this resolution and just learning more about the history we have. And so as you go through the bill, you really see that, you know, the Air Force was founded in 1947. And interestingly enough, Wyoming, you know, this small state, small and amazing state, let me say, we had even a longer heritage, though, with the Army Air Corps, because they were actually training strategic bomber crews in World War II up in Casper. So not only with F.E. Warren here, but we've got a great and rich history of our support to the Air Force. And so it was very interesting going through this resolution and reading a lot of these things. And of course, as all you know, F.E. Warren has actually been a very, very key component to our ballistic missile program and they go, I believe F.E. Warren was actually founded even before the Air Force, before that 1947 date. So that history goes way back. And it's actually kind of fun too. I know that sometimes it might be a little bit boring, but as I went through it, I actually had never taken the time to read who was F.E. Warren, which is a great story in and of itself, as it turns out. As he turns out, is our first governor, a senator of our state, clear back in the day. So the history is really great, but let me just talk about a little bit of this. You know, obviously F.E. Warren plays that strategic role in our that critical role in our strategic defense with our ballistic missile program. In many cases, they've been the first to operate some of our very unique missile programs, and I think even to date, they're responsible for some missile programs that are very rare, and we were the first ones to deploy them here in this state. And then, of course, with the Air National Guard, you got to give them credit as you go through this. You guys all know the Air National Guard, and they're not just here. And as you guys heard from the governor, I think this House heard from the governor not too long ago, how he took the opportunity to go see some of our soldiers, some of our National Guard soldiers overseas on the missions they support. And they support not just those overseas missions, but many of your communities have had the opportunity to experience their support as well. And if you go through this resolution, they have some great examples of critical services and critical areas that they've supported here in the state. And so I want to make sure that we give credit to those folks as well. And then they've had a very close relationship with the University of Wyoming. I know they had established the Air Force ROTC detachment has been over there since 1952. Interestingly enough, when I went into the Air Force, I actually wasn't in ROTC, but that group supported me. Anyway, I wanted to present this resolution. I'm looking for your favorable consideration, and I would recommend everyone just take a couple of minutes, look through the great relationship we've had that Wyoming has provided, the great relationship between the Air Force and Wyoming, and I look for your favorable consideration of this resolution. Thank you.
Representative Stiver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As an Army guy, we're short and sweet to the point. Support the chair force.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to reflect on this as well, spending over 21 years in the Air Force specifically, but I want to remind us originally about 1862. The 1862, specifically the Railroad Act of 1862 was signed by Abraham Lincoln. That really is a genesis of F.E. Warren Base today. When Abraham Lincoln and his advisors actually put in that a plan for a military base on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, that's what started really the genesis of this. I will share with you that ultimately better minds came to be because it's evolved from a frontier infantry, and we won't talk about that other branch of service, to the betterment of the state to be an Air Force base. So with that being said, I strongly encourage you to support this great recognition. Thanks to my fellow military members, and salute to Representative Locke.
Any further question? Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Brown's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it does so with the recommendation that Senate Joint Resolution number 5 do pass, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Senate file Joint Resolution number 5 is passed committee of the whole. We are now on our next bill. Let's see. Which one is it? Okay. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 83. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 83, sponsored by Senator Rothfuss. K through 12 school facility leasing, an act relating to K through 12 school facility leasing.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Northrup?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the
Oh,
committee,
uh,
oh, we have to read it?
I need to read the standing.
Standing Committee Report.
Mr. Speaker, your committee number 4 Education, to whom is referred Senate File 83 engrossed, K through 12 school facility leasing, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Allred, Andrew, Berger, Brown, Clauston, Northrup, Obimueller, Provenza. Excused, Representative Lawley. Representative Northrup, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Northrup?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole reports, it do so with the recommendation that Senate File 83 do pass. There is an amendment, and that amendment and the explanation of the bill, I will pass over to the good representative from this area.
Chairman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'll go ahead and move Standing Committee Amendment number 1, and I'll work it into the bill as we get going here. Mr. Chairman, what we've got here is a fairly simple bill that has a lot of writing in it, and really what we're trying to do is fix a problem that was created about 5 years ago by your Select School Facilities Committee. And what it ultimately boils down to is when it comes to leasing and major maintenance, we put in a piece of legislation about 5 years ago that told everybody to kind of aggregate it. And then when that occurred, what we noticed is that the aggregation actually kind of drew some constraints on how the major maintenance funding was actually being directed, and whether or not the money was actually being spent on major maintenance. So what this bill is doing without the amendment as it stands right now is trying to aggregate the lease payment where there's no mechanism right now to make sure that major maintenance funds are spent directly on major maintenance. We want to make sure that that's occurring and that we're not sending into a lease agreement. We're spending money in that lease agreement that says money is supposed to be going to major maintenance, but then it's getting used on something else and the major maintenance not being done. So we're trying to do that. It separates the major maintenance funding from negotiation in the lease and isolated an account controlled by the board. If it's a charter school, it would be controlled by the charter board, not necessarily the school district. And then it requires that expenditures from the account be approved by the board prior to release for the purpose of major maintenance. There's no change whatsoever in cost or anything along that line. We're just trying to fix a statutory error that, when it gets put into practice, things kind of get messed up a little bit. And then the last thing that it does, Mr. Chairman, is this amendment was brought to us in committee, and this is a really good amendment, and I'm glad for the good president down at the end of the hall here. What he caught was currently in statute, if a charter school is applying in a district and there's a vacant building, let's say, sitting around in that district, there's current statute that says the charter school shall have preference to be able to utilize that building without the district saying yes or no. But there's no mechanism in statute that gives the directional authority of who can say that that district actually has excessive space and what that excessive space can be used for. And so this amendment, as it's read in here, basically says, hey, look, the State School Facilities Commission and the State Construction Department, School Facilities Division, can actually make that determination by looking at everything that they have. So they've got all that mechanism and all that information. And if you look at the amendment, it'll actually say that the department actually has that opportunity to make the determination of whether or not space exists within the applicable school district for the operation of a charter school. And the other thing that this amendment does as well, Mr. Chairman, is it makes this effective immediately. And a big portion of why this makes it effective immediately is we do have a couple of schools right now, one in this county and one up in Natrona County, that are looking for new spaces to be able to rent out and open up their charter schools, but there's no mechanism for this to be actually occurring and for these schools to actually move into those district buildings. So we're trying to make sure that if these charter schools are up and running and they're ready to go, that they have first dibs on those other buildings. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would call for question on the amendment unless there's an actual question coming on the amendment.
On the amendment, Chairman Washut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question for the bringer. In sum total, would you say that this amendment is helpful or harmful to the charter school movement in Wyoming?
Chairman Brown.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is what I would say is probably one of the most helpful amendments you'll see for the charter schools in the state. As it stands right now, there's no mechanism for determination to be made on whether or not there's excessive space for a charter school to move into. This amendment directs the State School Facilities Commission and the department to look at that and prioritize that if there is space, that charter school then has the first priority of accepting that space.
Question called on the amendment. All those in favor of Standing Committee Amendment number 1, say aye. All opposed, no. Back on the bill. Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Northrup's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report it, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 83 do pass, please say aye. All opposed, say no. Senate File 83 has passed the Committee of the Whole. We are now on Senate File, thank you, Senate File 80.
Senate File 80, sponsored by Senator McEwen. Visitation rights, an act relating to public health and safety. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 1 Judiciary, to whom is referred Senate File 80 engrossed, visitation rights, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Chestick, Crago, Haroldson, Jennings, Nemec, Oakley, Provenza, Rodriguez-Williams, Washit. Representative Washit, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Washit?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it do so with the recommendation that Senate File 80 do pass. And I further move the adoption of the Standing Committee amendment and the explanation of the bill and the amendment turn over to the good representative at the back mic.
Representative Haroldson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I love my introductions. I'm now that representative at the mic. So before us today, we have Senate File 80, and I'm going to walk through the bill, and then as we get to the places and points that we're going to talk about the amendments, I'll bring that in. And so Senate File 80 at visitation rights, one of the things I think we've seen as we've walked through the last 3 years is the fact that hindsight's 2020, and we were all kind of hit with a conversation where we said, you know, how do we handle visitation through a pandemic, and how do we handle all these things? And so last year we got to see a bill come forward that wasn't quite the answer, and so in the interim, Senate File 80 was built in conjunction with our hospital association and building kind of an idea of how is the best way that we can address the issue of visitation and do it in a way that's going to protect people, but at the same time not isolate individuals from being able to see their loved ones, and as we heard earlier, we've got options for clergy and stuff, but this would be kind of just that general visitation. So on page 1, line 11, under visitation, the current bill would read a healthcare facility that provides 24-hour per day care, including, and it goes through a list. And as we went through this in committee, we understood that there is already a definition for healthcare facility on Wyoming Statute 35-2-901AX. And so instead of us building another list of facilities, we're going to instead, the amendment actually adds in here after line 12, after care, it just inserts that as defined in Wyoming Statute 35-2-901. That way we are congruent with current Green books in the statute, and it doesn't take away from the bill at all. If anything, it adds a little bit just as clarification. Going on to page 2, it talks about person that would receive care in the facility. The visitation requirements under this section shall not apply to persons that are involuntarily detained under Wyoming Statute 2510-109 or 2510-110, or adults who have been convicted of a crime and are in the custody of the state or local jurisdiction. We thought about that, and it came to our attention that sometimes when an individual is in a situation and gets themselves hurt doing something nefarious, they get brought to the hospital and they have not yet been convicted, but they are being charged with. So we're adding there on line 4 in the amendment. We're adding after Ben on page 2, line 4, charged with or convicted of a crime. So just to clean up there. And then really the meat of this is on page 2, line 7, and it goes through and talks about how the hospitals can help with visitation, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, and how the hospitals ultimately can help decide what PPE is worn, what situations those visitations can be in, but it also gives the ability for some freedom for individuals to be able to visit their loved ones. Down on the bottom of the page on line 22, we got to see where there was a stipulation, actually starts in 20. It says a healthcare facility shall provide a written copy of its visitation policy to every person admitted to the facility or to that person's representative. We thought that would be a little encumbersome for a hospital to have to provide the visitation policy to every individual that's admitted. So the standing committee amendment there eliminates after policy to every person admitted to the facility or to the person's representative. That is struck. And after policy, it says upon request. And then down on the bottom, it says, still shows that it shall be visibly posted at the facility. So it's posted. Upon request, you can get that. And that pretty much, that takes care of the standing committee amendment and how that went in. And the bill just goes the rest of the way through and basically just gives those sideboards or parameters for visitation. This is not saying visitation's allowed all the time, no matter what. We don't care. That's not saying that, but what we are saying is there has to be that preference and privilege for family members to be able to visit if they are, understanding they're going to have to wear proper PPE and they're going to have to do it in these confines. And so with that, I would ask for a favorable vote on standing committee amendment number 1. And with that, I call for the question on the standing committee amendment.
Question being called. On standing committee amendment number 1, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Standing committee amendment number 1 has been adopted. We are back on the bill.
And with that, I call for the question.
Question being called on Senate file number 80. All those in favor, please say aye. All opposed, say no. Senate file 80 has passed the committee of the whole. Our next bill up is Senate file number 146. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 146, sponsored by Appropriations. State-funded capital construction, an act relating to state-funded capital construction. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom is referred Senate File 146 engrossed, state-funded capital construction, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Henderson, Larson, Nicholas, Sherwood, Stith, Walters, Swanitzer. Representative Nicholas, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Nicholas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move in the committee of whole rise and report. It does so with a recommendation that Senate File 146 do pass, and I will turn the explanation of the bill and the standing committee amendment over to the 2 good members of the Joint Appropriations Committee who are standing up front. And so you may recall, ladies and gentlemen, that we do 4 bills in appropriations: the budget bill, a capital construction bill, a direct funding bill, and one other one. But so this is one of the projects that we've been working on through the summer. And so what they'll walk through this bill and the amendments to it and how we came up with these particular programs and the funding. So I'll turn it over to the good representative from Fremont County.
Vice Chairman Larson Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for particularly the freshmen who are with us. The CAPCOM bill includes a significant number of construction appropriations, and it's separate. We've been counseled to keep that and advised to keep that separate from the budget bill. So every year you'll see a capital construction bill that for state facilities and other construction needs around the state that the state participates in. If you have your CapCon bill in front of you, I would ask you to maybe turn to page 8, section 4, where similar to what you see in the budget bill, you'll see the acronyms and what the funding mechanisms mean, referring to the source of funding. For the majority of the explanation of the bill, we'll use kind of similar to what we do in the budget bill and have the summary sheet, which you'll see on page 11. And then we'll refer back, we'll use this summary sheet, and I'll refer back, as will my good colleague, on the pages that are applicable to the summary sheet. And so as we worked with over the past year, one of the concerns the Department of Construction have is we had a number of construction projects in process, and the impacts of inflation on those projects was, you started to see, you would have, if you were here last year, you'll recall that we had several, in the budget bill, had several appropriations in this bill to fund deficit funding in projects that were already in place. We've done one up in the county named after a famous president, and I think there was one other where they just needed the extra money because of pressures from inflation and challenges with materials. And so on line 5 here, where you see the state facility inflation reserve, that's impacted, and it refers, and we appropriate $51 million there. You'll see that on footnote 1, where of that $51 million, $26 million goes to state facilities, $24 million is allocated for anticipated inflation impacts to community colleges. This does not mean, and this is important, to if there is a project in place, this is not intended now to give that project that's in place, if they don't need the inflation, it doesn't allow them to have an enhancement that they didn't already have in place. It's just to protect the project, the base bid as it come in, and against the inflation pressures, material pressures that were coming into that. So that's footnote 1. And then on line 6, you're going to see SBC cost escalation and de-escalation fund. So the previous one, the $56 million, was for projects that were already in place. This $7 million is taking a play out of the playbook from our department that oversees road constructions, where they, as they work with contractors bidding projects, the contractors are always trying to anticipate the impacts that they will have during the duration of their project on materials and labor and other things. And so what they do is design into the contract an escalation and de-escalation clause that says, in this one, if you would look on page 3 and 4, you'll see that if you see an escalation of up to 7.5%, or they would have to absorb that escalation in the materials or price. And if there was a de-escalation where they actually got more money, they would be able to capture that and save that. Above that 7.5%, on up to 30%, the state would cover that extra cost up to the 30% of escalation costs. But on the reverse side, if there was de-escalation, the economy turned around and there was de-escalation, and all of a sudden 2x4s or concrete, rebar, whatever that construction material was, seen past that 7.5%, a decrease in price, the state would benefit from that. And the Department of Construction, the director has used this in previous places where he's worked, and it allows the contracts from the contractors to come in a little tighter because they feel a little more protected and don't have to bid the blue sky that sometimes they're required to do when you're in a volatile economy. So if you would then go down to line 8, you will see, in fact, I'm going to take you to line 9 first. You're going to see the State Fair. This is the Department of Agriculture, but at the State Fair, the Fair Board has done an incredible job of trying to revitalize and re-identify what the State Fair does, and a lot of that is we've got to rebuild and do some construction. And so they came to us with their first, they've got 3 levels, and in the first level, the first thing they asked for is to be able, this $452,000 for the demolition of the Fort Washakie dormitory. They funded an estimate to come in. They evaluated the hazardous materials, put a proposal together, and that was how they reached that estimate. We thought that we ought to try and move that process on a little faster. And so on line 8, we appropriated an additional $500,000 to be used in that first tier, and that goes to, that is identified on footnote 2, where we say with that $500,000, then they're required to also generate for every $5 an additional matching dollar to help get more of these projects done. As you come down then to line 10, there is a $12.5 million ask for the Riverton office building. This is a conversation that both this body and the body down the hall has had over a period of years, and it kind of runs on the tail of the office building that we put in Casper, where we consolidated state agencies for efficiencies and for the benefit of the community. In Fremont County, Riverton has a significant number of state agencies there, and the thought is to set aside this fund. The initial appropriation that came from our good friends down the hall was $34 million. This started on the Senate side. They've reduced that to 12.5. Along with that, if you would turn to page 17 through 22, it makes reference to a task force to look at and identifies the need to bring the legislature and the agencies in that area together to determine perhaps a location, the size, the square footage of that office building, and report back to the legislature before we appropriate any of these funds into as we prepare for any construction documents or planning. We need the task force, similar to what we've done with the Thyra Thompson building, would do some of that preliminary work and then come back for legislative approval. Line 12, you will recall in the budget bill in the Department of Health, we give them authorization to take $39 million of reversion funds, money that they would revert back to the general fund and use for the demolition of that agency's vacated buildings at the state hospital. In this document, on page 2, we establish the account, the state hospital demolition account, where up to that $39 million can be parked. We don't know what that amount will be this year because we don't know the amount of the reversions. But what we are saying in this bill on line 12 is that whatever that amount is, if it was the total 39 million or 22 million, the maximum they could use this year would be 15 million to start that demolition process. On line 13, this makes reference to the a building that is being refurbished on the campus of Wyoming Life Resource Center for the Department of Family Services to use. As they got into that building, they found some conditions upstairs and in the parking that weren't covered, and they had to tighten up some things in the floor and do some work there. And we felt that this was the time to do it while they had that building gutted and not try to go back in and do it after they had moved in. And so that's what that $500,000 is for. I want to make sure that I've covered everything on my end, and I believe I have. And so with that explanation, maybe to this point, if there's any questions, and if not, then we'll turn the remainder over to my colleague from the center part of the state.
Okay, we do have a standing committee amendment number 1, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the standing committee amendment, I believe, has been moved, and I will incorporate it as I continue the explanation of the Senate File 146, the State Capital Construction Funding Bill. And so we're still, members, we're still on page 11. Now we're on line 14, and we're moving into the community college projects here. And so we'll start with the LCCC exterior facade. This is to redo the outsides of 4 different buildings that are starting to have some decaying in between the facade and the building structure. And so that is to try and maintain those buildings as long as we possibly can and not have to replace those. Line 15 is the Western Wyoming Community College. That's over in Rock Springs, the Power Line Tech and Construction Tech program. So that's putting in not necessarily a building, but a facility to allow that community college to teach folks how to work on these large transmission lines. You know, there are several of them that will be going in across the state of Wyoming and originating in the state of Wyoming. And so I would call this almost an emerging labor technology. And so it's really exciting to see that. Moving on to so that was line 16 and 17, or excuse me, 15 and 16. Moving on to line 17, the Northern Wyoming Community College, the Orndorff building. This is what I would call a capital renewal project. It's a little bit more complex than a major maintenance project, as they're going to go in and use the frame of the building, but redo a bunch of the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, as most of that is 70 to 80 years old and needing updating and work in that regard. And then we'll move on to line 18. This is $25,000 to the Community College Commission for a military-friendly campus to aid in the purchase of a military memorial. And that is noted in footnote number 5. And so the Community College Commission will administer that and might divide it among the various community colleges. Then we'll move on to line 19, and this goes to our good office of that administers our state lands. And so the state owns what I would call a historic ranch in the state, and it's really not very many acres, but more of the historic ranch buildings, owns several of them, and this is one of those. And this one happens to be titled Ranch A, and so this is to put $1 million into fixing up parts of Ranch A so that we have a well-maintained asset that the state already owns, because we don't want to let our assets fall to the ground. And then line 20, the Department of Corrections and the Women's Center roof. And so these roofs, they have a lifespan, and this one came to the end of its life expectancy, and it's time for it to be replaced, and that it is having some failing issues. And so again, trying to maintain these facilities and make sure that we take care of those. So that is the remainder of the items on the list on page 11. The footnotes, as my good colleague and I have both worked our way through those, are shown then on the bottom of page 11 through all of page 12. And we'll move on to page 13, but I see my good colleague would like to follow up on something before I start on page 13.
Representative Vice Chairman Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague. I did forget one thing before we get into some of the standing committee amendments, and really an important part of this. I would direct your attention to lines 22, to page 22, 23, when we talked about demolition. Another 2 areas of demolition that we have is we have an old penitentiary, the North facility in Rollins, that has been there, and we've never demolished it. It's becoming a mess. And likewise at the Honor Farm in Fremont County, there's an old administration building that has been vacated, and they've been wanting to demolish that for a number of years. We're allowing the Department of Construction access up to $10 million into the state penitentiary fund to get that demolition done. I apologize that I didn't get that done originally. Thank you.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so starting now on page 13, we move into the capital construction projects for our good university. And this is really where the standing committee amendment comes into play. And so we have three major projects occurring over at our good university. One is our residence halls, one is an upgrade to our War Memorials West stands, and one is an upgrade or replacement of our Corbett natatorium or swimming pool. And so all of those projects have seen significant inflation factors over the last several years as we have worked to get those under construction, get those budgeted for and planned for. And so in the budget currently, or in the capital construction bill currently, if you'll notice on line 7 on page 13, there's $70 million. And that's really about a little over half of what they need to get these projects done. And so then we'll move into the standing committee amendment. And it really starts, we'll start on line 6 of the standing committee amendment. And we reduce that 70 million down by 25 million to 45 million. And then from there, the best thing to do is to jump over to the bottom of page 2 of the standing committee amendment on line 32, but really on line 34 where it starts. So we create the University of Wyoming 2023 capital projects account, and we appropriate into that $120 million. But then what the remainder of that section 11 does is it really allows us to cash flow this project over 3 years. And so if you'll think of it this way, it's 45 million in year 1, and it's 40 million or somewhere in that range in year 2, and the remainder in year 3. And the biggest reason for that is we have to be able to put the money up front so that they can go out and sign the contracts, knowing that it will be paid for. But they don't need $120 million today. And so by doing it this way, those funds remain in our savings account, generating interest for the state of Wyoming, versus transferring them directly to the university where they would generate interest for the university. So this allows them to draw on those funds over the next 3 years to complete these projects. But because they don't need all the money on day one, it allows that money to stay here with the state. And so that's what the remainder of that section 11 amendment does. Then it goes on later in the amendment, and now we would be lines on section 11 of the actual bill on page 23 and 24. It's significant reporting requirements. Well, we come in this amendment, and this would be on line 22, page 3 of the standing committee amendment. And we just simplify the reporting requirements and say we want them to report on the construction budget, the construction status, timelines, fundraising, and matching efforts of all the University of Wyoming construction projects that are supported by the state appropriations. And then if we move on the standing committee amendment, page 3 again, on down to line 35, and this is really a moratorium on their ability to continue constructing. And so this says this is line 35, page 3. The University of Wyoming shall not engage in any new capital construction projects until the projects provided in this section are completed, except for major maintenance projects, emergency projects, projects at the ag experiment stations, projects funded entirely by private funds, or projects related to research or instructional needs. And so again, they'll have a significant amount of construction going on the university campus. And we in our committee felt like that's plenty, and we need to maybe pump the brakes a little bit. Let's get the projects we're working on completed and then move forward. And so that's what that prohibition does. And so that's the standing committee amendment regarding the inflation needs and how we're going to address funding those three projects. Then, Mr. Chairman, back to the bill on page 13, we have the line 8, page 13, the AMK Ranch, which is located up in Jackson, right on the banks of Jackson Lake. And this is to allow them to expend $10 million of private funds Anything over $1 million, whether it's the university or the community colleges, all requires our authorization, the legislative authorization to spend. And so again, this is a 10 million, all private funds for activities that are going on at that facility. The university has had a relationship with that facility for about 60 years, and they do quite a bit of research out of that facility regarding various bears and berries and everything else that you can imagine. It's quite a facility. And then on line 9, page 13 of the bill, again, friends, is the science initiative. This is $12.25 million to finish the final shelled space in our science initiative building over at the university. And so then you'll notice on line 12 of page 13, it refers back to the inflation reserve, and this is to be used just on these projects. It's just as my good colleague described on the other projects. This is not to expand the scope of any of the previously approved projects. This is simply to address the inflation that has been brought on over the last few years since these projects were first considered. And then on subsection B down there, we discuss a little bit more about the fact that the residence halls are the primary priority, and then it moves on to the other construction projects. So that is how we address that. Now also in the bill, I'd take us back now a few pages, and we're going to go back to page 5 of our bill. And what we do on page 5 through page 8 is in 2019, the legislature set money aside to be available, 49 million combined in these two sections here, to be used by the university if necessary to try and pay off some old bonds and things like that. Well, the university never drew on those funds because it wasn't financially feasible for them to, because the interest rate was far higher than what they had on the existing bonds. So it was cheaper for them to continue paying the bond rate they had than to borrow from the state to pay off bonds. And so that funding is just sat in our good person that manages our money and signs our checks down in the one floor down from us here. And so what that section does is it reverts that $49 million back to the LSRA. So again, that section on pages 5 through 8 reverts $49 million to the LSRA. So that is the section there, and that is the University of Wyoming inflation reserves and whatnot. And so with that, I'll take some questions before we move on to some other sections in the bill. And hopefully my explanation of how the standing committee amendment plays into that part of the bill at least makes sense. And there is some other sections of the standing committee amendment that I will get to, but that's how the standing committee amendment and the bill relate for the university currently. So again, take some questions on that.
So Representative Walters, do you want to do the standing committee amendment at the moment, or do you want discussion on the whole bill first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's hold off on voting on the standing committee amendment for just a couple more minutes, as there is one other section to be discussed in it.
Okay. Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the good representative, I mean, I know you guys go over and over and over this, and you know it very well. But to deal exactly with that on page 4 with the, let me see, the Wyoming Student Housing Account. When I was down there, and this may be, well, I'll wait for you to explain it. When I was down there, one of the main concerns was the housing and how there was just lots of need there for different things. And then, so I'm seeing, what I think I'm reading is that there's an account being set up, but then I see that the money is going to principal, and the treasurer shall disperse funds from, and I know you were explaining some of this a moment ago, upon request, anyways, it was going for the principal and things like that. So it wasn't really going to I don't see where it is doing anything for the housing. I just see for the exchange of money into different accounts. So I was wondering if you could explain some of that. Thank you.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, that really starts on the top of page 5, technically on the bottom of page 4, but the real meat of it starts on the top of page 5. And so what that's doing is that is bringing in session law from 2019. And so in 2019, there was created the Wyoming Student Housing Account. Money was put into that account. And the goal at that time was to allow them to pay off some old bonds, which would create more bonding capacity for the university. What the university experienced at that time was the bonds that they currently held were at a better rate than they could borrow the money from the state of Wyoming. So they never accessed any of the funding in this account. So to be able to transfer all of this money back to the LSRA, we have to bring in all of the 2019 session laws related to this account. So that's what you see there. And then if you'll go on to, that's page 5, but if you go to the top of page 7, and that is where on the top of page 7 is where it all reverts back to the LSRA. And then again on the bottom of page 8, on March 24th, all of these funds in these accounts revert back to the LSRA. So between the $15 million on page 7 and the $34 million on page 8, all of those funds will revert back to the LSRA. But to effectuate that, we have to bring in all of the language from the 2019 session laws, because at the time, that looked like it might be a good vehicle to help fund the housing project. So then in 2020, the university went out, sold bonds on the bond market, got a very good rate, favorable rate, and that is the funding being used today to initiate the housing projects. And there is housing being built at the university campus. Will be under construction by early summer this year. The infrastructure for that has been put in place over the last 18 months or so, as they've done significant work over there. So this will not, by reverting these funds, will not slow down the housing project. What we need is the standing committee amendment to be able to continue to move those projects forward then. And that is what we do in the standing committee amendment. So I would just say, think big picture. Don't worry about the words on 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8, because that's old session law, and the goal is to revert that total of $49 million back to the LSRA. But again, we have to bring all that language in because we're getting rid of those accounts, bringing that money back, and it's the last couple paragraphs on page 8. Page 8 of the bill, lines 11 through 14. All unexpended, unobligated funds appropriated under this section shall revert to the LSRA on March 24th of 2023. That is the real key of the language from page 5 to page 8, is that action taking place. The other stuff, again, was an approach taken by the legislature in 2019 that hasn't borne fruit the way it had hoped, and so bring the money back to the LSRA is the goal of that. And so I hope I've explained that a little bit better. There's no new accounts being set up in that part of the bill.
Representative
Follow-up,
Baer.
please. Oh, could I have a quick follow-up?
Follow-up, Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to belabor this. So where is the account for the student housing?
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Within the university, we don't necessarily have an account for University of Wyoming student housing. They have an account that they are using because they bonded for those projects. They went out and sold bonds on the bond market. They use some of their direct revenues that they receive through the state to guarantee those bonds. It's something they have done for many, 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 many years. And the reason, because the dormitories are more of a enterprise system, is why we don't do private fundraising for dormitories. Most campuses, essentially all campuses, do not. And so that is why the university, within their own internal bookkeeping, has dedicated the bonding that they sold for the student housing project. And so that's where the account is held, is within the university.
Thank you.
Representative Baer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for the bringer of the amendment, and specifically on page 2, this section 11 dealing with $120 million for construction at UW. I have to ask, why are we starting new construction? A wise saying is that a man should count the cost before he builds a tower, and we seem to be continuing to start new projects, but we don't ever finish them before finish those projects before we start a new one, and then we continue to come back to the state for more funding. It was mentioned that this 120 million was not necessary right now. I think I heard that as I was walking out in the hallway, and so I guess my question would be, why wouldn't we as a state offer 40 million or some number like that, and then offer another 40 million the next year as the construction moves, and put some sideboards on it so that they stick to one construction job until it's done, make sure it's paid for, especially since this is dealing with inflation. And right now we see inflation going all over the place. It may go up, it may go down, but we need to do this responsibly if we're going to build these projects. We have the first one was authorized in 2018. I think that's what you're discussing as far as the session laws of 2019. And I do appreciate the committee's efforts to get that back into LISRA and then use the money again, reappropriate it. But I guess I would just ask, can we not do this in tranches instead of all at once, and then ensure that the university is using the money wisely as far as finishing a project before the costs are adjusted so much that we have to come back with more money from the state?
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that question. I think the good representative said he was walking through the hall, so he may have missed what I was describing. And so we allocate the 120 million for projects that are already ongoing and already approved by this legislature. So the three projects are the housing project, the War Memorial West Stands, and the natatorium. We authorized those projects, two of them a year ago, and the other one, the housing project, about 4 years ago approximately. So those are authorized projects that the two that we authorized last year were not fully funded last year, with the expectation that we would come back and fully fund those. The 120 million that we discuss in that is so that they can sign the contracts. And then to the good individual that just asked the question, we're doing exactly what he just expected and what he just indicated. They know they can sign the contracts because they know the 120 will be there over the next 3 years, but it allows them to spend that over 40 million each year. And instead of coming back and asking for it, they can't sign contracts when they do that because these projects will cost more than that. And since we've already approved the projects, they're already raising private funds on these projects. This is how we, the state, can actually save ourselves money by keeping these funds in our control instead of at the university. The money will go out on cash flow over 3 years, but it's guaranteed by creating this 2023 capital projects account. It's guaranteed that over the next 3 years, they will receive these funds. They just don't get it all up front. And that is what's going on. So I think the person that just asked the question, he laid it out exactly how we want this to work. What he described is how this will work is each year a little bit will come out, and they'll be able to sign the contracts now knowing that they can move forward, but they'll basically draw on it as needed over the next 3 years. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. Representative Walters, I think you answered most of my questions there. So basically, if I'm understanding this right, you're taking the three prior appropriations and putting them, or three prior coffee cans, and moving them into a bigger coffee can. Is that correct? That's 120 million. And my question is, how does we just create that account, or how does that count? If you could walk me through that, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative Walters.
So, Mr. Chairman, a little misunderstanding in that question. There is not three prior appropriations. There's been three prior approvals of projects. Money was applied. The housing project was approved, but no money went towards the housing project initially, as that was to be self-funded. But between the time they went out to the bond market and sold the bonds and the time they signed the contracts to construct the buildings, the costs have gone up more than they ever anticipated. And so the largest portion of this will be used for the housing project. Then a year ago, we authorized $50 million to be spent on a couple other projects, two of which are listed in this bill, the War Memorial West Stands and the Corbett Natatorium. And so those projects were underfunded. We knew that a year ago, and we said we'd come back and address it this year. Well, now they're to the planning. They've reached it far enough along in the planning phases. They're ready to sign the construction documents. They can't sign the construction documents without knowing full funding is backing them. So the full funding will be there because we, the state, are guaranteeing it, but they aren't going to spend the full amount in year 1 or year 2. And so then over the next couple years, it will cash flow out. So it'll be about 45 million this year, 45, 40, whatever it's not to exceed 75 million in any one year. And so there's not, I wouldn't call it any coffee cans. It is just how they will receive the funds in a cash flow mechanism. And then if you go, and so yes, we are the legislature. We create this account. It's called the University of Wyoming 2023 Capital Projects Account. Is hereby created. We create the account right now. That's what we can do in the legislature. It's a beautiful thing. But then if you go on to the top of page 3, at bottom of page 2 and top of page 3 of the amendment, it says no projects will be, or no distributions out of this account will be made after these projects in this subsection are complete. So this is just for these 3 projects, the housing project, the West Stands, and the Corbett Pool Natatorium. So hopefully that helps to answer some of those questions.
Chairman Washut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question about the recent fire in the dormitories over at the university. Whether or not how extensive was the damage? Are we going to have a budgetary impact to restore that building to make it back usable? And while we're at the same time looking to replace it.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have not had a complete update on how extensive it was. I do know, just like the community colleges, the university is basically self-insured, and so that will be something that they take care of on their own and really has no impact on the student housing that we're discussing in this bill.
Representative Pendergraph.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would begin very briefly by thanking the 2 representatives that have explained this. I feel like you did an excellent job, and it makes sense to me. I would point out that my living is made remodeling. I do a lot of maintenance. I do a lot of fixing things, and that's important, and it needs to be done because it's an integral part of stewardship. So once we've acquired something, whether or not we should have acquired it, it is our responsibility to maintain it, to maintain the value of that, and I appreciate all of that. But as I hear the projects come up, there are a lot of them that, of course, I know nothing about. One of them, the AMK ranches, I understand there's some private funds expended there, that situation. But I start thinking about, we've got all these properties all over the state that we are responsible for and to maintain. So my question is this: whenever these projects come up or these requests for funding, is there an automatic part of that discussion concerning divestiture? Do we ever consider, is it a good time to sell this and get out of it and quit binding ourselves to having to keep up with all of this stuff? I guess, to put it succinctly, how much of this stuff do we really need? And do we regularly consider getting rid of any of it? Thank you.
Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I'll just answer that question real quickly. The answer is absolutely. Most of these properties, to acquire them, it comes through this body. So when we acquire them, this body has to approve it to add on more properties for the state parks. We have the ability to, if this body so chooses, to divest us of those particular parts. If we so choose, if we go and ask the state parks to evaluate their property, tell us what the best thing is, the most expensive with the least amount of folks that use it, that we want to divest ourselves of. So it's our decision to make those determinations. And we see what the cost is from every single property. We know what it costs. And so that the committee that does that in this body reviews those on a regular basis. So that's the process for how that happens. So I want to go back a little bit and talk a little bit more about the University of Wyoming. And also, because this is an appropriations bill, you know, it is derived from our work with our folks down the hall. And, and so it's already been down, it's, actually, it started on our side and started on that side and came down to us, and we just finished working this about a day or two ago. And you'll see that the appropriations originally for the university was 70 million, and that was a compromise that we reached with our friends down the hall. But when we did it, remember we talked about cram downs and whether and how much we're going to let, we just run over them and then we just get reversed automatically. So on the University of Wyoming, we knew that we were going to have to add some more money back into this because we chose not to do a cram down on our good friends down the hall. They respected that because after this bill went down to the Senate, we then sat down and continued to negotiate, basically informally, with them on how to fund the remaining obligations of UW. And this amendment is a product of that negotiation. So that this has already been reviewed by the Senate appropriations folks down the hall. And so that's why we're bringing it in this fashion. This wasn't the way we really wanted to do it. Our preference was just to take that 49 million that was already sitting over there in that account and just move it over and add it to the 70 and we'd be done. But they said, no, we want to do this on a 3-year basis and to follow the process, and we want a moratorium on building during that 3 years or for however long to build those buildings. So that's how this particular amendment was derived. Now, I want to, for those of the folks that you were not here, this swimming pool, we tried to get this built 2 years ago. We tried to get it built in 2013. I went to school to the University of Wyoming, and I graduated from law school there. I was an undergrad there in 1978, and the pool was in disrepair then. Literally, it was in disrepair then. The pool is not Olympic size. They cannot hold swim meets there because the pool's too short. It doesn't have a high enough ceiling to do any diving in that pool. And so this has been on the back burner for literally 20 or 30 years to get fixed. And the problem is you can do football stadiums, you can do other things like that. You get donors, people will raise money, people won't do it for the swimming pool. And so about 2 years ago, we bundled these goods together, the natatorium and the West Side stands. And our good folks with the Cowboy Joe folks that like to raise money have promised about 20 million in addition to go to the West Side stands. And then the last 2 years happened. So we've had literally anywhere between 25 to 35% increase in inflation since the time that these were originally approved in the prior sessions. So a swimming pool that was going to cost roughly 35 to 40 million is now literally, the current price tag is 82 million. The West Side stands was originally roughly around 50 to 60 million, is now 110 million. And so with these dollars that were over the 120 that we're expending over the course of 3 years, we're requiring that the folks across the side of the mountain to come up with the rest of the money to finish these projects. And that was also our discussions with our friends down the hall, and that's how we came to this conclusion. Plus, they have to finish the dorms. And as the good representative from Casper said, the dorms were bonded. And we required that, and then those dorms were put together. We had a working group in this legislature. We had spent a year taking hearings and testimony and looking at the different types of dorms and pricing them out. And they've been under construction. They demolished 3 buildings. They put up a new parking lot, put in all the infrastructure. They've spent literally, I don't know the exact number, but easily 30 or 40 million already on those dorm projects. There'll be a new cafeteria, a new dorm. That's about a 289 million project. And then they have another dorm after that when that's done to be completed. And so those are projects that are on the way, they're sailing. So we said, and they need a couple 20 or 30 million more for that to finish those next projects. So we said, this is the amount of money you're gonna get. It's gonna take for 3 years, and you're only gonna get this much per year, and that's the agreement we reached into. So the UW is going to come up with easily $100 million of their own money to finish these projects. Thank you.
Vice Chairman Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a question for the members of Appropriations. Were there projects from that 2020 CapCon bill that haven't been either solved in this bill or the two from 2021, 2022, that ended up getting left by the wayside.
Representative Walters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the question about a capital construction bill that did not make it to the finish line a couple years ago, most of those projects have been picked up over the last couple years, and the last of them, I believe, are in this year's. But yeah, we've made up for lost time in that regard, but it's cost the state a significant amount of money because inflation has impacted every one of those projects that did not take place when that bill didn't make it to the finish line.
Representative Hornock?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you expand on there was mentioned earlier just that we're trying to avoid a cram down situation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because it seems like the amendment adds, we're putting the fund together with the $120 million. Seems like that's a lot more than what was in the account. I like the idea of how we're doing it, and especially that we're capping construction. We got to get these projects done before we, move on to other things. But it seems like the amendment adds quite a bit of money from what our counterparts down the hall kind of talked about. Can you just elaborate on that just a little bit?
Representative Walters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Combined with the amendment and the engrossed bill before us, there's actually about a $60 million savings because we revert the $49 million and then it's actually more than 60, it's close to 75 million because we revert the 49 million and then we reduce in this bill this year's expenditure from 70 down to 45 million. So there's actually a savings between the bill and the appropriation or the standing committee amendment in this as it sits here before us today. Now, what took place regarding the House, the number of members in the House versus the number of members in the Senate on the committee, the House position would have been to put the 70 million in general funds as is in the engrossed version, and then spend the 49 million directly on this project to reach $119 million. And instead of doing that, we simply said, we'll do the 70 million right now, and let's continue visiting throughout the session on how we can get to that 120 million point. And really the chief executive even brought this up in his budget message to us when discussing the capital construction bill, is knowing that these funds are not all needed on year one. How do we phase this over multiple years? And so over the last several weeks, we've been able to come up with this plan, and that plan is what's before you in the standing committee amendment. To say, yes, the 120 million is guaranteed by the state. That's when we create the account and say that amount will be available over the next 3 years. And that's when you move on to the next part of it in subsection B, or actually subsection C on page 3 of the amendment. And that's where it discusses $40 million or is amount needed to pay off the outstanding balance not to exceed 75 million in any one given year. And so that's the cash flow. That's the work that's been done over the last several weeks, both with the chief executive as well as our friends down the hall to try and figure out a way to get to that 120-ish number. Like I said, the House position would have been put the 70 general fund in, spend the 49 that was previously appropriated. You're at 119, close enough to 120 to get to where they needed to be. And so, but again, because it's not all needed right away, this allows us to hold that in LSRA over time. The state generates the interest and then releases it to the good university as those projects move along a little farther and as the funds are needed a little bit more. So that's how that came about. And really, I think it's quite a silky smooth solution to a rocky project here.
Okay, members, we do have a standing committee.
So, Mr. Chairman,
please.
If I could continue, if there's no more questions on the university component, I would continue with the standing committee amendment so we can get on to the vote on the standing committee amendment. So then, Mr. Chairman and members, on the standing committee amendment, if you go to page 1, line 24 is where it starts. We insert a section there. And so what we insert is in subsection B, $3.5 million to the Business Council for a grant to a community winter recreation center. And that grant would be conditioned on a 1-to-1 match from in any source of, and the in-kind could work there. And then if we move on to the top of page 2, line 6 in subsection C, again, to the Wyoming Business Council, this time for $3 million for a grant to, for rehabilitation of a historic building in a historic coal mining community for the purposes of downtown revitalization and multi-purpose community activity center. And again, this grant would be conditioned on a 1-to-1 matching source there. And anything that is not encumbered or obligated by June, the end of the biennium of 2024, so little over a year from now, would automatically revert. And so that's the remainder of the standing committee amendment. I'd take questions on that component and then would call for the question on the standing committee amendment before we get back to the bill and discuss the last couple sections in the bill.
Okay, you've heard the motion on the standing committee amendment number 1. We do have more discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Newman.
Thank you. I wonder on the standing committee amendment on page 2, where the funds are appropriated to the Wyoming Business Council, and also in the regular bill on page 16, there seems to be a special appropriation, I might call it, because the qualifiers are pretty specific to certain communities. And I'm wondering if this is a policy decision that this body has made, that we will direct Business Council funds to specific projects without those projects going through the Business Council process. Because these appropriations seem very specific to very specific communities and very specific projects. Thank you.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll address, if we could, if it'd be all right with the body, I would address the ones in the standing committee amendment, since that's what we're working on currently. I'll get to the one that's actually in the bill on page 16, as the good chairman pointed out, when I get back to the bill. But since we're on the standing committee amendment, the reason we direct the funds to the Business Council is that's the organization that we have structured throughout the state over time to handle these sorts of community-related enhancement type projects. And then these are some needs that we had communities come forward, several communities come forward with various ideas along these lines. And so we said, okay, well, since you're the organization, this is the organization that handles these community enhancement type of projects, and these are the types of projects we're hearing from various communities that they're looking for, and that's how those came about. Again, referring to the standing committee amendment, and that really the explanation is the same for the bill, but we're on the standing committee amendment, and so that's why I'll focus it on those expenditures.
Mr. Speaker Pro Tem on the amendment. Stith.
Mr. Chairman, to address the question about the descriptions that are relatively specific. So for the community winter recreation facility, today it is 0 degree. Right now it is 0 degrees in Riverton, Wyoming. There is a building there that is constructed. It has 3 walls. It only has 3 walls, and it has an ice rink in it. So having only 3 walls is nice for the ice to freeze, but that's also where they put the stands where the spectators sit. So the spectators actually sit outdoors. And so this is for all the spectators and the freezing children of Riverton that we want to take care of. Theoretically, so, and with respect to the other project that's listed there, it's actually a project that was previously approved by the Wyoming Business Council. And so this is a continuation of a project that they've already invested in.
Further discussion? Representative Hornick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question back on the University of Wyoming construction items. So the amendment actually, and just for clarification, the amendment actually takes away just the inflationary reserve idea, correct? And just kind of puts it into a capital projects account. Is that correct?
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would contend that they're one and the same in this regard. Yes, we title it the Capital Construction 2023 capital projects account, but it is all related to the inflationary concerns that these projects have had and experienced. So if it's really semantics at that point, but that's the purpose of it, is all for the inflationary experiences that these projects have had over the last couple of years.
Any further discussion on Standing Committee Amendment Number 1? Representative Hornack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that then, if we're divvying out those funds over several years, we're going to know the costs. So why do we need something that kind of targets some inflationary factors to this?
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's back to the point of the difference between the House position and the Senate position. We're going to know the guaranteed maximum price of these projects within the next 2 to 3 months. That's why we need the $120 million allocated to the account up front, so they can sign the contracts for a guaranteed maximum price on these projects. Inflation will have been addressed, because when we have first approved these projects a couple years ago, they had a price tag attached with them. Now we've gotten to the point of being ready to sign the contracts through the design and engineering and everything. Now we're ready to sign those contracts. Inflation has taken place, and now additional funds are necessary. So to allow them to sign that contract, we guarantee it with the $120 million allocated to the account. But it doesn't actually, all 120 doesn't actually flow into the account. It is just a known fact that it is available for the account. The money then is requested through the treasurer's office in a cash flow fashion over the next 3 years. So it is, again, it will be a guaranteed maximum bid. We will know the price. There will be no inflation factors applied to it over the next few years, because those contracts will have been signed at that guaranteed maximum price. That's what the first phase does. Then the next next phase of it is the cash flow over 3 years. So that's the purpose of this. It's not that we're going to be divvying it out over 3 years wondering what those costs are. We will know that cost within the next couple of months, and we know what are pretty darn firm on them today. We just haven't signed the contract to say, yes, they are carved in stone versus carved in ink, you might say, is the difference right now.
Any further discussion? Representative Hornack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of final, I guess, comment on the amendment. I know that we did a large renovation on the east side of the stadium several years ago, and we've been doing projects in the area quite a bit. When do we get to a point where we say, we're looking at $110 million for the renovation of the west side of the stadium? When do we get to a point where we kind of judge whether or not that project is worth it, or if we use those funds for other things within our general budget? I know that we did the east side of the stadium for quite a bit less than this. I know that construction costs have increased, but $110 million, if that's the actual cost, and from what I just heard, it could be even more. When do we, as a body, kind of make that decision of saying, sorry, not this time, not this project?
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to correct some things that were just stated. It was never stated that the west stands is $110 million, because it's not $110 million. It's significantly less. There's 3 projects that will be addressed with this funding of $120 million. Student housing, West Stands at War Memorial, and the natatorium. Those are the projects that are listed here. It's not one project at $110 million. Second, the guaranteed maximum price will be signed in the next few months. We will know those costs. They will not. No one has ever said those costs will be significantly more going forward. These are set factors. So the notion that was ever stated, I don't know where that came from, but that was not stated. These will be known numbers. They will be signed contracts, and we will know what they're going to cost at that point in time. That is the purpose of setting this money forward so they can sign the contracts today, get the best price today, so we aren't dealing with inflation over the next 3 years, and then cash flow them over 3 years as the concrete is purchased, as the structural steel is purchased, as those projects move forward, then come and access the funds. And in the meantime, those funds sit in our account generating interest for the good state of Wyoming. So this is a very responsible way to do this. And when is enough enough? Well, I think we're doing quite well. If you took the construction dollars to do the east side of the stands, it would cost far more than we're going to spend here if we were to relate those into today's dollars. Secondly, if you go just down to 70 miles across the border down here, they just spent $350 million on a building half the size of what we're doing. So they college campuses nationwide spend lots of money making sure that they have good facilities for learning experiences and for all the experiences that take place on a college campus. So our good university is very responsible with our dollars, I believe. They do a good job of providing a great environment for our students to create well-rounded, good learning folks as they send them out into the world. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would call for question on the standing committee amendment.
Speaker Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just on in support of the standing committee amendment and the bill. But what I really want to say is if people have questions of this good committee, take it offline and ask them. Just a suggestion so we can get through maybe one more bill by 6 o'clock today. Just a suggestion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question being called on House Standing Committee number 1. All those in favor, please say aye. All opposed, say no. Standing Committee Amendment number 1 has passed. We are back on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So back on the bill, now we're on to page 14. And I know my good colleague and I, we've jumped around this bill, but we've tried to do it the bill is random, and so we've tried to keep it somewhat organized. So now we're on page 14 of the bill. We're on section 6, and this is in regards to our good law enforcement academy. They're doing some projects up there, and all this does is allow them to use the already appropriated funds for their level 1 and level 2 recognizance and feasibility studies, and include the office, the housekeeping area, the locker room, the storage, and remodel part of this project. And the reason they want to do this is all of this is centrally located in the other parts that are already being looked into. And so it simply makes more sense to try and do this as one piece instead of several pieces in which you don't get the economies of scale. Moving on to section 8 in the bill, the Thyra Thompson building or the Casper State Office building. If there are reversions, as that project is essentially closed out, just to move any budget funds that are left in that account, just move those over to the State Building Commission's contingency fund. And I'd offer that project was on time, under budget, so there should be a little bit moving over. Don't have an exact amount just yet, as they are closing out a few punch list items on that. Then we move on to the section 8 on the bottom of page 15, and really the meat of it moves on to the top of page 16. And with that, this is $4 million to OSLI for the purpose of providing a grant for infrastructure for events for indoor and outdoor rodeo, and with certain seating capacities. And this too requires a 1-to-1 match factor of any source. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, that wraps up the entirety of the capital construction bill, Senate File 146. If there's other questions on 146, our committee is happy to take those. If not, I'd call for question on the bill, and thank you for your time, members.
We do have Committee of the Whole amendments. Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 of Senate File 146. Representatives of the 67th, as good stewards of our taxpayers' money, I would like to encourage your vote in favorability in deleting the Standing Committee Amendment, which we just heard, beginning on page 1, lines 24 through page 27, or page 2, lines through 27. If you have that in front of you, specifically, I want to talk about 2 areas here. The first one, beginning of line 26, there's appropriated $3.5 million regarding a Wyoming Business Council to provide a grant for a community winter recreation center. I want to share with you as a body that these are worthy projects, so don't misconstrue my message in this case. At this point, it's my belief and others' beliefs that this project really is not ready for prime time. It actually lacks some definitive scopes, milestones, and defined deliverables. Additionally, if you go to page 2, lines 6 through 11, you'll see there's appropriate an additional $3 million from the general fund to the Wyoming Business Council for providing a grant for the rehabilitation of the historic building in the historic coal mining community for purpose of downtown restoration and revitalizations of the multipurpose community center. Ladies and gentlemen, there's some of which this needs done. We don't disagree with that, but specifically in your consideration, I want to share with you that while these projects, I think we need to see more defined deliverables, specifically, as I mentioned, some of which are needed. But prior to this, and granting us money, and we push this out maybe a year or 2 years, but more importantly, there is, to enable these projects to continue, we allow them or give them the opportunity, more importantly, to use ARPA funds and or SLIB monies, et cetera. So my amendment for your consideration, preferably favorable, is that we take the $3.5 million and also the other $3 million for a total of $6.5 million, delete that on those respective areas that I've mentioned, and return those $6.5 million back into the general fund. I think that would be a very admirable goal and, more importantly, an admirable amendment. And I'll stand by for any questions.
We are in committee of the whole, amendment number 1. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem Stith.
Mr. Chairman, so yeah, these provisions that would be stripped out by this amendment, they are pretty prescriptive projects. But I think we may want to take a deep breath and think about what's good for the state and what's good for democracy. Because what we did last year, say with the ARPA bill, was to take a pot of money and give it to an organization, a state agency, to kind of divvy up according to a process, and that worked okay. But if you think about it, is it really so much better to have unelected officials making the decisions about where the money goes? So sometimes it can make sense to prescribe how money gets spent. That's what we do. That's democracy. And think about all of the children, the hockey players who are freezing in this small town with a 3-sided ice rink. It's really sad. So please vote no.
Chairman Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the question that I asked prior, and I guess this is a policy decision for this body. Do we want to take money awarded to the Business Council and then we forego all of the procedure that the Business Council has in place to grant this money? And I find that is not a good policy. And so on and in favor of this amendment.
Question being called. All those in favor of Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say no. Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 has passed. We are now on Committee of the Whole Amendment number 2. Representative Larson, J.T.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, members, I bring you Committee of the Whole Amendment. All right, let's see. I move Committee of the Whole Amendment number 2 to Senate File 146 and ask for your favorable consideration. Members, what this does is basically, if there's any money left over in the inflation dollars account, that money could, up to $5 million of that money can be used to go to the Business Council for community revitalization grants. And an important thing to note or take note of is these grants have to be matched 1-to-1. So it's not just us handing out the dollars for free. There has to be some investment from the community. So with that, I'll ask for your favorable consideration.
Any further discussion? Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to encourage a no vote on this and remind the body that in the budget, we put $5.5 million into these kind of projects already to go around the state. And if the if we want to do this kind of projects for these revitalizations, let's just fund it directly and know what that amount it is, as opposed to trying to gather up reversions and do it. Let the reversions flow as they need to when they are coming from multiple sources and trying to collect them up into one single source. We do this in other places where they're focused on singular agencies, singular topics. But here where we're trying to go out and gather it up from one place and shift it around to another, again, I just encourage a no on this.
Representative Zawonitzer, Dan, Chairman.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a great amendment. Sometimes when we collect reversions and people find that there are reversions and we can put them back forth to do good things, we certainly do that. It's just, however, sometimes when the Appropriations Committee does it, it's allowed, and when they don't like it, it seems to be resisted. So this is one of these places that I think we found some reversions. I think this is a worthy project for all of our kind of larger communities to do some downtown revitalization efforts that we all know we certainly need. I think we do a lot of stuff in the state for our small towns when it comes to water projects and some other things we've done this session. And so trying to get some, we'll just call it revitalization projects in our downtowns of our towns and our cities is a really great endeavor, and look forward to some of the worthwhile projects coming forward in this regard.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will also stand against this amendment. I did a little bit of research when I seen this amendment coming up, and to give you some ideas, folks, of some current programs that are already available right now that we have not fully funded, but are funded. We've got one here that, and I won't read off the names of the programs. If you want to see this list, I'd be glad to share it. One of them has $54.3 million appropriated in 22 and 23. Another one has $5.5 million in it. We've got another one with $10.176 million in it. We've got another one, the House just recently approved $26 million in direct local government funding. Multiple, as I was told, multiple other programs and federals that are designed specifically to do with what this amendment's doing. So I would suggest that you push back against this. There are multiple opportunities right now that are currently available. The funding is there. So let's just stick with that and not create, and I know it creates heartburn, but let's not make more coffee cans. Against the amendment.
Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the amendment, although I really think it's a clever, neat idea, just not this year.
Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this is an amazing idea, and I am all in. I'm only upset I didn't think of it myself. This is a great way for us to kickstart our historic districts and to support all of our small mom and pop businesses that create jobs within those districts. So thank you to the bringer.
Any further discussion on the committee of the whole? Representative Larson. JT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just reminding everybody that if there is no more inflation dollars left over, then this just doesn't get funded. So you don't have to worry about whether it's on that end of things. So just go ahead and vote aye, and it's a feel-good bill, or amendment, so do it.
Representative Oakley, are you at the mic? Any further discussion? Question being called. All those in favor of the committee of the whole amendment number 2, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Committee of the whole amendment number 2 has failed. We are back on the bill. Any further discussion? Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for
go ahead.
I'm trying to find the right page. The section 27, capital construction projects. So on page 11, we've got $51 million in inflation reserve. So $26 million for state facilities, $24 million for community colleges. I guess my question is, I would like some detail on, usually when you fund these projects, you build in a contingency fund for these projects. Hopefully you do. seems to me that, over $51 million we've got going toward inflation. I'm just wondering really how we have missed that so much and why there can't be a little bit of scope reduction on these projects in order to stay more within budget if the project overall price gets this far out of hand. I'd like some more detail on what we've got going on that line item. Thanks.
Vice Chairman Larson. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just remember, these are the projects that are already in process, so scope reduction becomes much more difficult at that point in time. If they were the new projects, it would be different. I think there is generally about a 5% contingency on each of these projects that are built into that. We're experiencing more than that at 20 to 30% in some cases, not all cases. So that's there. Doesn't mean that it's going to be used, but we don't want to get a project stalled out till we have to come back and appropriate for it. Happy to visit with good representative to provide more details, and happy to have him visit with the agency that put the numbers together.
Any further discussion? Representative Walters.
Thanks, and I'd just add on to that. This will be applied towards 35 ongoing projects that total about $1.2 billion out there. So I think it's a certainly reasonable question on the bill.
Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Nicholas's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 146 do pass, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. Senate File 146 has passed the committee of the whole. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take just a little privilege. As you know, we only have 2 days of committee of the whole left. And so there's a ton of files on the general file, and they're falling off quick. But Representative Larson, JT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to Rule 15-3, I demand a cuspidor.
Whoop. Representative Larson, could you tell me the rule 15-3? Did a what? Can I proceed?
Yeah, just need to say chief clerk would get a customer.
Test bill.
Say chief clerk would get Representative Larson a customer.
Would Madam Chief Clerk please get Representative Larson a cuspidor? Okay, the next bill for your consideration will be Senate File 174. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 174, sponsored by Senator Driscoll, Wyoming Charter School Authorizing Board, an act relating to charter schools. Mr. Speaker,
Please, reading clerk,
Mr.
proceed.
Speaker, your committee number for education, to whom's referred Senate File 174 engrossed, Wyoming Charter School Authorizing Board respectfully reports same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Allred, Andrew, Berger, Brown, Clouston, Lawley, Northrup. Noes, Representatives Obermueller, Provenza. Representative Northrup, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Northrup?
I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 174 do pass, and I will turn over the explanation of the bill to the good representative from Senate 11, and he will turn it over to another to explain the amendment.
Chairman Olson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's going to be hard to compete with all the enthusiasm around the gifting that just took place, but I'll try. I bring you Senate File 174, Wyoming Charter School, Public Charter School Authorizing Board. Folks, what we know is that Wyoming parents want school choice and they want educational freedom. What this bill does is it empowers parents to have more choice and control in their children's education through the authorization of charter schools. It creates more choice for parents. Parents are the clients of education, and therefore they should have choice in where to send their kids, how their kids are educated, where and when and how. As you may recall, a few sessions ago, we instituted a pilot program where we created an independent authorizer for charter schools in Wyoming. That pilot program was under the SLIB board, and that legislation capped the total number of school applicants that could exist at 3. We had 3 applicants and 3 authorized charters this past September. So that pilot program is now capped out. And we can all agree, and many of us do, that the SLIB board was an imperfect authorizer. Thus comes this bill. The bill's intent is to replace the SLIB board with a focused independent board that's independent and dedicated exclusively to either approving good charter schools applicants or rejecting bad charter school applications. It would be its full-time job is to decide whether a charter school should be granted a charter. Just a slight fact here on the independent authorizer, there are 22 states that allow for independent authorizers, so we would be joining those 22 other states that allow for an authorizer that's independent. For those of you that may not be terribly familiar with what I'm talking about when I say an independent authorizer, under existing Wyoming law, you can apply for a charter for a public charter school through your school district. That's the existing law, and that's the existing path. The independent authorizer doesn't replace the school district. You can still apply for your school through a school district. What it does is give you an alternative authorizer, which is this board. So Senate File 174, the engrossed version of the bill, increases accountability for charter schools and authorizers by placing some common sense guardrails on their powers and duties. It sets up the independent authorizer, as I've been discussing. It utilizes current agencies and departments, specifically the WDE, instead of creating another layer of government to staff that board. It leaves the ability for local school districts, as I pointed out, to work with their charter schools or even to authorize them. And for those that are already authorized, they can convert from district schools to public charter schools under the authorizing board. The bill includes robust language for charter school boards by outlining prohibitions of conflicts of interest, general duties for the authorizing board, and codes of ethics for those authorizing boards of public charter schools. Now, it also keeps in place existing statutes that require charter schools to comply with all state assessments and standards. Keeps in place statutes that require charter schools, the teachers there, to be certified by Wyoming Professional Teaching Standards boards, including background checks. Requires charter schools to comply with all laws and regulations pertaining to school finances. Requires charter schools to comply with applicable state and federal laws, including our Records Act and our Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It requires charter schools to comply with all applicable state and federal regulations, prohibiting discrimination and complying with state laws, regulations, and policies for educating students with disabilities. So we're talking about IEPs, et cetera. And it requires charter schools to be non-sectarian. That's existing statute. All of that is upheld through this legislation. Finally, a couple of things left. It creates equitable funding. Under the previous legislation, the SLIB board legislation that I was referencing earlier, charter schools were only entitled to 80% ADM, whereas a traditional public school would get 100% ADM. This bill restores funding for 100% ADM, which arguably it would be unconstitutional to fund some public students at 80% while we fund other public students at 100%. So it does clarify that constitutional issue. And the last thing it does is it gives an LEA status to the authorizing board or authorizer for charter schools who are authorized under this Wyoming Charter School Authorizing Board. What that does as an LEA status is it allows them to receive special education funding for services that they provide. And that is the bill. I will say, Mr. Chairman, there is a substantial standing committee amendment that results in a substitute bill. So I could take questions, and I certainly will. However, at least my caution or recommendation to the body would be that rather than discuss things twice, if we take up the standing committee amendment first, then you will be discussing what is now the bill, since it is a substitute bill.
Okay, thank you. We are standing committee amendment number 1. Any discussion?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. We're actually not there yet because it has not been moved yet, so.
Oh, okay. Any further discussion on the bill? Oh, you're going to move the bill.
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Thank you.
I would move Standing Committee Amendment number 1, which is substitute bill number 1 to Senate File 174. And I will explain if you, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to Senate File 174 and you go to the amendments page and you look at the traditional amendments, you'll see the substitute bill, and it is lengthy, but it's actually smaller than the original bill. And what I will tell the body here is this is a compromise, and nobody walked away from this discussion, and nobody walked away from this entirety of a process happy with everything. But we all got pieces of this puzzle known as charter schools. We all got little pieces that we wanted, and we came to a compromise. So what I will do with the entire body is I will walk you through page by page, and instead of giving you the differences between the original Senate File 174 and what we took out versus what we put in, I plan on just going over what we kept in because it is more pertinent. I will highlight a few areas that were substantially changed to make sure that everybody is aware. So I'm going to start, Mr. Chairman, right over onto page 2, and this is one of the more substantive changes of the bill. Page 2, if you look at lines 10 through 23 and then over to page 3, lines 1 and 2, you'll see that the size of the board, the authorizing board, is now 8 members as opposed to 5. And what we've done with this is we have 3 members appointed by the governor, 3 members appointed by the state superintendent of public instruction. One is the chairman of the State Board of Education, and the other is the dean of the university's College of Education, or his designee. One of the important pieces of this is the state superintendent of public instruction's appointees must have at least 5 years of Wyoming education experience. We left that pretty broad for a reason. We'd like that to be, doesn't necessarily have to be public education. It doesn't necessarily say private education. It can be pretty much anything. If you spent 5 years in going to school, you're qualified. So we put that out there, but we do need to make sure that the people who are being appointed by the superintendent of public instruction do have Wyoming backgrounds in education. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 7, or I'm sorry, page 3. On line 7, there was an area here that we did remove, which in the original 174, there was a commitment that the board members appointed needed to show a demonstration to commitment of charter schools. The committee kind of felt like that really wasn't necessarily the best way to go when we're talking about public schools in general. We talked about about traditional schools and charter schools. They're all public schools. So we want to just take that out. So that is one portion. And then another portion that we took out was there was an ethics clause in this original portion. And I'll go into that in a couple of different areas, because what we do with this board, as well as any other board that is done with the charter schools, is now subject to the Ethics and Disclosure Act, which is Wyoming Statute 913-101 through 913-109. And if you flip over to page 4, you'll actually see that down on line 17 and 18, and that is where the majority of the information is going to be brought in. Mr. Chairman, moving over, I'll flip through this as quickly as possible. I know it's a lot of extra work here, but I want to make sure that everybody understands exactly what we're voting on. Moving over to page 5, duties of the state superintendent, underneath lines 11 through 15. This is, we had a budget amendment that was contingent upon the passage of this bill, and that particular budget amendment says, hey, we're going to fund a position for a liaison between the charter school board and the Department of Education. That is exactly what this portion does. Moving down at the bottom of page 5 is just conforming amendments. Moving over to page 6, you'll also notice on lines 10 through 11 that the governing board of a charter school is now held to the Ethics and Disclosure Act as opposed to the language it was in original Senate File 174. Moving that over, what you'll also see is all of this additional language that starts on page 6 at the bottom, moving over to page 7. This is all the original intent. However, when this bill came to us, this was definitely drafted in a different format from a different state. And what we did is we cleaned this up in statutory construction just to make sure that it fits within Wyoming's structure. And that's really all you're seeing. So all the intent of the legislation is originally there. It's just, it looks a little different, and it's in a different location than what 174 originally had it in. Moving over to page 8. We tightened up the language on lines 10 through 14. Again, same intent behind that legislation. It's all the same. It's just a little bit tighter and a little bit cleaner language. We also had some inconsistent language on 21.302.1. Specifically in subsection D, there was some inconsistent language with our current state statute. And so you'll actually see that back on the last page that we just talked about. That is on page 6 and moving over. So we cleaned that up in this particular section. And then that moves over to page 9, where we just have some conforming changes. That was all original language in 174. Into page 10, this is probably one of the largest changes that this particular amendment affects. In 174, there was an area called subsection G. And subsection G basically exempted charter schools from requiring, it was kind of worded weird, and what it did is it kind of flipped our situation right now that all of our charter schools are sitting underneath as far as the charters themselves, and it flipped them on its end, and it said, hey, look, if you want to open up a charter school, you are completely exempt from all state and federal rules and laws. And that is not at all what our committee and or anybody was actually intending to do with this particular legislation. And so instead of trying to clean up subsection G and trying to tighten that language up, we felt that it was best to just remove that subsection G from this bill, which keeps everything status quo in law, which says, hey, you're allowed to operate a charter school and you're allowed to go out and hire teachers that are maybe not certified, but you have to go through either your school board, your local school board, or you have to go to the state board for any type of exception. And that's current state law, so we're not changing anything there. We're also not upending that completely and trying to change the way that we're doing business with these. So I think it's really important on this to make sure that we all understand that there are currently 8 other charter schools in this state that are operating underneath those principles. And so we needed to make sure that if we're going to authorize another 3, that they need to be operating underneath the same statutory language that the original 8 were already authorized as well. Moving over to page 11, lines 13 through 15, some tightened up language. Subsection Q there is the original from 174. Moving over to page 12, we had some inconsistent language here on lines 10 through 12. This was tightened up and rearranged a little bit to make sure that it was not inconsistent with current statutory language. And down at the bottom on page 12, you actually have a copy of the charter being executed, the actual document that proves that a charter is up and running. This was held in a later section in 174. This was moved to be statutory compliant and in a better location underneath the actual contract law within this section here. So that's where you'll see one of the major changes as well. Moving over to page 13, one of the other changes that we had, the original 174 said, if you have a charter school, you're going to have to be reviewed every single year to keep up with your charter. And we don't do that for even our current public schools, our current traditional schools. So we didn't feel like it was necessary for these charters to go through a review every single year. So we mimicked the exact same language that our current traditional schools do, which is you have to be certified the first year and then once every 5 years after that. So you'll see that on lines 4 through 9. And then also in here, we also have the application as far as the closure protocols. This again was in a different section. And what we're saying is when you apply for your charter, it now has to be done. You now have to have the closure protocols in your application instead of something. If this charter school decides to close, we want to make sure that this is taken care of way beforehand and not oh, we don't know what to do now. And now our kids are kind of stuck without how do we transfer our students to make sure that they don't have any learning disruptions as they go along. So that's where you'll see that 17 on lines 11 through 14. Going down here to pages 13 on lines 16 through 23 is all original language from 174. All original language from 174 onto page 14. And then on page 15, one of the terms that we changed was a migrated school. We don't use that language inside our current statute, so we changed this over to a converted charter school. And again, this is something that the good representative from House District 11 was talking about, that we do have the authorization now. If somebody wants to be a converted charter school, they can go to this authorizing board and convert underneath this board as well. Going over to page 16, correct location here on this one as opposed to where it was originally located. And then what you'll notice is the lines 11 through 15, we actually had an interim education committee bill that was trying to work on some of the statutory language that we had messed up with our bill last year. And what you see is the only piece standing out of that particular bill is on lines 11 through 15. And this cleans up some information that was brought to us by the department. So out of a great piece of legislation, this is the only piece that actually stood the test of time and made it through. And then over on to page 17, you will notice that on lines 6 through 10, we have the school's plans for identifying, providing an education to all students enrolled or to be enrolled in the charter school, including but not limited to students with special education needs, students who are English language learners, and gifted and talented students. So we had a very similar piece of language, but it was in the wrong location and it was not broad enough. It did not include all of these students that are required underneath federal law. So we included that over on page 17. I promise you we're getting close here, ladies and gentlemen. On to page 18, you'll notice that back onto page 17, oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry. Back on page 17, you will actually see that subsection D is a lot of current state statute, and then all of a sudden on page 18, you just see one piece of language that's stricken. And what that is actually a piece of legislation that we passed last year that actually repealed 21.3.310. And so that was repealed last year. This could have gone into the reviser's bill, but anytime you start adding Title 21 into the reviser's bill, people start seeing some potential black helicopters. So we wanted to make sure that we just included it with this. Subsection H was originally in 174 in this particular area. It is no longer needed because we kept subsection G in statute, which basically eliminated the need for having subsection H from 174. 174 was also inclusive on 21.3.309 on page 18. This was all original language. And then moving over to page 19 is the second largest piece of this particular bill. And this is what the good representative from House District 11 was talking about, that we needed to make sure that we were constitutional with these charter schools. When we put in this charter school statute, it originally funded students at 80% ADM. We are no longer going to do that. We are going to give them 100% ADM at the district level, which provides them all the funding necessary. But then what you'll see is we also remove any amounts generated underneath paragraphs B30 or B29 and B30, which is central staff and administration in attachment A. And then also in 21.13.309 MVE3 through 5, which are additional district level pieces. And I can go over those in detail if anybody wants, but don't know that that's overly necessary, but really what it boils down to is extra compensation for teachers at the district level, isolation maintenance, and tuition and maintenance if you have a student placed out of state. Moving over to page 20, these are two fixes that needed to be done, and this is also for constitutionality purposes. You'll notice that on line 6 through 9, you have 100% of the amount expended for the charter school that is eligible for reimbursement underneath 21.13.320, that's your transportation. So the same thing that we do for our current traditional schools, and 21.13.321, that is your special ed. So we want to make sure that our special ed students and the transportation costs are reimbursed at the exact same rate our traditional schools are. And then the interesting one here is 9.3.413. That is the employer's contribution to retirement. Just making sure that we are funding these students at exactly the same rate that we're doing in our traditional schools. Mr. Chairman, I have the last little bit here is in section 4. This is our non-codified language, and there are 3 important provisions here that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. The first one is subsection A here. The Wyoming Charter School Authorization Board has the opportunity to oversee any of the current boards or any of the current charters that were approved underneath the SLIB board. And since those are actually in contract right now, we require those to actually have a contract amendment filed and transferred over to this new charter school authorization. And that is just to make sure that we effectuate the change from SLIB being the authorizing board. Moving down to subsection B, we have that no more than 3 charter schools can be approved right now. However, if one were to fail for any reason, we wanted to make sure that our ability to have those 3 charter schools authorized by SLIB still remains at 3. So if one of them closes, the third one can reopen, and we keep that language in here. And then the last 2 pieces here that I think are extremely important is we do have a slight moratorium on additional charter schools. And the reason we felt that this is important to have is to ensure that we understand the costs associated with the 3 charter schools that we put into place last year. And right now it's somewhere in the range of, we believe, about $16 million, but we want to make sure that we understand what those costs actually are. And so before we authorize anything additional, we want to understand 100% what the effects on not only our block grant model are going to look like, but we also want to understand what these look like as far as attainment and what the students are doing and how they're learning, what the impacts of the local school districts are going to be, whether or not, if we have somebody up in the northern part here from Chugwater, if it crashes, if we have a charter school up there that takes all but 3 kids from that school district, we want to make sure that we understand what the implications of these 3 charter schools truly are. And so we have a moratorium until 2028, but the other piece of this is after 2026, we do authorize 1 additional charter school to be effectuated and brought into this because we do believe that we'll have enough information at that point to at least bring 1 more in and see how that affects the changes as well. And then, Mr. Chairman, the last piece of information that I think is incredibly important for us to understand is subsection D, and this is a directive to the state superintendent. And what we're going to receive from the state superintendent is ultimately that cost figure that I was just talking to you about. And that is an understanding of everything that we have that is associated with these charter schools. We want to know the costs. And we want to know those costs up and down, inside and out, so we can understand exactly what we have done, not only to our local school districts, but also to these charter schools, to ensure that when we move forward with our next movement on charter schools, we understand exactly what we've done. So, Mr. Chairman, that is a lengthy explanation of substitute bill number 1, and I will stand for any questions.
We are on the standing committee amendment. Speaker Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I just want to say that I support this substitute bill, this standing committee amendment. There was a lot of us worked really hard to get this done. We think we've found a good compromise. I think we worked with all the parties. We worked with the sponsor of the bill. So I just wanted to stand and say that I support this substitute bill, this amendment, the standing committee amendment, and I would urge your adoption.
Majority Floor Leader Nyman on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I too want to echo that as a signer on this particular piece of legislation. I do encourage all of you to support this and to move this piece of legislation forward. Been a lot of changes, probably not exactly what we anticipated to begin with, but that's the reality of where we're at. And that's how the legislative process works. So we're good with this and would really appreciate your support.
Any further discussion? Question being called. Whoops, 1 second. Excuse me. Representative Overmueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm agnostic on this bill, but I just want to talk to you about what we're looking at and some things that can't be ignored. There's a handout under my name with a bunch of little numbers and little boxes. Surprise, surprise. If you'll look at that with me, I think it's important to understand a little bit about how school funding works before we just plunge forward with a process of authorizing new schools around the state. So as you look at this handout, you can probably find your school on this list, and on column C, you'll see the cost guaranteed.
Representative Obermueller, are you on the amendment? And the amendment is to have a substitute bill. And if you are, continue, please. I don't have access to the chart.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, please continue. My apologies.
So the column C is the cost guarantee of the state share. So in school funding, the target is the cost of education, and revenue has to be brought in to meet the cost of education. It doesn't work the same way as a general fund where we find our revenue and then allocate revenue. This is a different, schools are a different model where we have, where we figure out what it costs, and then we have to come up with the revenue to pay for it. So it's just intuitive to know that if we're going to build new schools out there, there's going to be a cost factor on that. And basically that cost will be borne, all else being equal, by the state as the cost goes up, because you'll see in column D, those are the school district local revenues, and assuming that's sort of a fixed piece in all of this for purposes of discussion, any new buildings will be covered by the state. Column 3 are the, just for fun facts, column 3 you see the recaptured districts right now. As you go down there, these are the districts that are paying money back into the system. Column F leads you to a net state share. Column G is the number of model students. The total of that is the 92,000 students. And so you divide that out and you can see by your own districts what your cost per student calculation is. If you go down to, you can see a wide range demonstrated when you go down to Sheridan and sublet. You see those side by side. One of them is 29,900 per student, and the other one is a kickback recapture county of 15,000. So the point is, what does this have to do with this bill that we're looking at? Well, if you are a fiduciary of state dollars and you're wondering how they're going to be allocated, they're going to go out there and build these new schools, and I would suggest to you that maybe you will be left out of this equation because not all districts will qualify to have a new school. In fact, that's the whole point of the commission, right? They form the commission. They will evaluate your districts for whether you qualify for a new school or not. And I would suggest to you that most of you will not qualify. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do we want to go down this road of building schools for somebody else when you will never have a chance for one of these? And so I would suggest to you that maybe you want to know that answer first. If you're going to set up a commission that has this particular ability to determine who will get a school and who won't, perhaps that's where you start, is to see where you rank in this process before you ever dive in here. Will you actually have a horse in the race, or do you have a three-legged cat? So it's a fair question, because that's the whole purpose of that commission, right, is to determine who's qualified and who's not. So really that's, so I'm just suggesting that maybe the first step is to do that kind of ranking study just to see where you and your schools would stand before we go down this road. So once again, I mean, one of these schools is already being built in my community through the SLIB. You know, we were one of the three, you know, that got selected, so we're already there. Just a point to make in your evaluation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Olson on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to briefly respond to all of that. I think there's just two real simple points. Number one, the substitute bill basically, through its moratorium and mandatory report, it creates a study period is what it does. It basically says that for the next 3 years and essentially the next 5 years, we're going to study what the actual cost is. We're going to have an actual report on the costs from the department that oversees our education, and you're going to know what all that looks like. And you're going to be able to digest all that over the next 5 years, because that's when the moratorium lifts and the board can authorize as many schools as it wants. And you can decide whether they're good dollars, bad dollars, okay dollars, whatever you want. But I also want to respond additionally to one more thing, and I want to push back on the dollars being a problem, because when we're creating when the board authorizes a public charter school, it's not like students are just all of a sudden created or farmed in from out of the state. They're Wyoming students that are going to be attending the public charter school, and they're Wyoming students that are already attending a public school. So if they're already attending a public school, the dollars are already being expended on those students. There are some startup costs to starting a school, there's no doubt about that, but the actual, this handout talks about the actual ADM, the dollar per student, and the reality is that you have the dollar being spent on the student in, say, my county at pick your school, and when that student moves, the ADM flows with it. That's the 100% ADM that we're talking about. So the dollars were already being spent, they're just being spent on a different school, minus your startup costs, I'll grant you that. But I just want to push back on that because I think it's kind of a false narrative that you can get spun in and you can get lost in it pretty easy. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And just a reminder that we are on the amendment, which is the substitute bill. And in the substitute bill, I just want to reiterate that there is a study to determine the cost. And so obviously we're going to vote on an amendment, and then we'll also have debate on the bill itself. So just a reminder of the process.
Representative Obermuller? Ogle. Okay, question being called on Standing Committee Amendment number 1. All those in favor, please say aye. All opposed, say no. Standing Committee Amendment number 1 has passed. We are back on the bill. Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Northrup's motion when the Committee of the Whole rises report to do so with the recommendation that Senate File 174 do pass, please say aye. All opposed, say no. Senate File 174 is passed the Committee of the Whole. The next bill for our consideration will be Senate File 112. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 112, sponsored by Senator Nethercott, Peer Support Counseling Confidentiality, an act relating to labor and employment. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 3 Revenue, to whom was referred Senate File 112 engrossed, Peer Support Counseling Confidentiality, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Bear, Byron, Harshman, Locke, Northrup, Oakley, Storer, Strzok, Zwanitzer. Representative Harshman, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Harshman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rise report to do so, the recommendation that Senate File 112 do pass. I think the explanation is the good Vice Chair. Okay. You're not one of the co-sponsors, but I think you're going to explain the bill. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So members, I bring you Senate File 112. It is regarding peer support counseling. Thank you. So what this does is it creates a sort of on-the-ground system of support for our first responder groups. So think, firemen, law enforcement, emergency services. I think it's actually sort of a brilliant concept that's becoming popular around the country because it takes advantage of the experience and the support of similarly situated colleagues or, and maybe possibly friends or people they work with, which is cost effective, it's productive and accessible. And if you think about it, it's another tool that allows us to recognize mental health issues, which is certainly significant, and there's a big need for this specific group with what they see and what they do and experience every day. So, Chapter 23 is created in the bill under Title VII. Again, it's peer support counseling. Going through the bill, it provides definitions, outlines the people involved, and provides for confidentiality, which is important. So, going through page 2 and 3, definitions. Looking at the bottom of page 3, peer support specialist is defined, which is really what we're looking at. A person who's designated by their agency to lead, moderate, or assist in a peer support counseling session. And further saying that a person who has received training in counseling and providing emotional and moral support for a colleague who was involved in or some traumatic events in the course of their employment. So it also talks about what is a peer support counseling session. So again, taking that peer support specialist and they have this session in response to a critical incident or traumatic event. Then the bottom of page 4 is an important to create section 102, which is in regards to confidentiality. Because, I mean, needless to say, when we think of going to like a professional counselor, you know that those are confidential. So we need to provide that piece out. So that's what page you see on pages 4 and 5. Then on page 6, there's exceptions to the confidentiality. Obviously, something like if the person expressed, suicidal ideation or something that needed to be addressed, and some other exceptions. What's the other one? Oh, like admission of criminal conduct. They can't, go in and start confessing to crimes and assume that wouldn't be passed on. So that's the bill. And again, I think it's a smart move. I think it allows fellow colleagues, people that may know the person or they feel a kinship to because they're similarly employed or using, and using that experience. And if you think about it, I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily so that everyone would need to go to like a decade of schooling in order to be in a position to give good support for people. And so that's the concept behind this, and this puts the structure around that. So that is a brief description and overview of the bill. And with that, I would ask for your aye vote. Well, did you want Representative Conrad?
Representative, is there any further discussion? Question being called for. All those in favor of Chairman Harshman's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 112 do pass. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. Senate File 112 is passed to Committee of the Whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 147. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 147, sponsored by Senator Anderson. Government Contracts, Labor Organization, an act relating to public works and contracts. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 10, Labor, Health, and Social Services, to whom is referred Senate File 147 engrossed. Government Contracts, Labor Organization. Respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Chadwick, Clouston, Hornock, O'Hearn, Penn, Ward. Noes, Representatives Trujillo, Yin, Zwanitzer. Representative Zwanitzer, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Chairman Zwanitzer?
Thank you, Chairman Zwanitzer. I move in the Committee of the Whole rise to report it do so the recommendation that Senate File 147 do pass. I would further move the Standing Committee amendment and turn over the representation of the bill to the good representative from District 18.
Vice Chairman Heiner.
Thank you, Chairman Zwanitzer, and thank you, Chairman Zwanitzer over there. Members, I realize it's Friday afternoon, so I'll try and keep this short and clear. What this does, 147, is that it protects how public construction work is contracted within the state, and it maintains a fair and open bidding process inclusive of all contractors, regardless of labor affiliation. It simply states that the state and local public entities, when procuring services for public construction, can neither require nor prohibit the use of project labor agreements as a condition for bidding and winning these contracts. So within the state of Wyoming, the statistics show that there's about 2.4% of our labor force is unionized. So if there was a PLA or project labor agreement required
for a public project, most of this labor would end up having to come from out of state because we don't have enough unionized labor within the state. So I have in my hands a letter that our chief executive officer signed with 18 other chief executive officers from 18 other states, where they talk about protecting policies that protect and ensure robust competition for taxpayer-funded construction projects that welcome all of America's construction industry to compete to rebuild our nation's infrastructure on an even playing field. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll go through a little bit of the bill, and then I'll bring in the standing committee amendment as I get to that point. So what this does is there's no special privileges allowed for construction projects with this bill. Any government entity will be open to all labor, whether they have a labor agreement or not. Now, what is a government entity? So I'll start on page 4, where government entity is defined. It means the University of Wyoming, the state, any department thereof, and any county, city, town, school district, community college district, other political subdivision, or other public corporations of the state. So anything that the state or the state monies would be involved with. So collective bargaining agreements, decisions should be between the contractor and their employees, and it should be their choice whether they enter into these PLAs, but it should not be imposed as a condition for competing for public funded projects. So the meat of the bill is on page 2, middle of the page. Government entities shall not, and going to line 15, shall not require or prohibit a bidder or contractor or subcontractor from entering into an agreement with any person, including a labor organization, in regard to a construction-related project. And then in Romanet II, subparagraph II, is where the standing committee amendment, and that's already been moved, I believe, Mr. Chairman. So the standing committee amendment inserts, subject to the provisions of the Wyoming Preference Act of 1971. So what that is that was enacted in 1971 to give preferential treatment to Wyoming citizens for public projects. So if a contractor wants to work in Wyoming with public money, they have to hire local labor force if it's available. And if it's not, they have to document that they can't find that labor within the state and then go outside. So that is included. And with no questions, Chairman, I see there is a question.
Okay,
on
we
the
are
standing
on
committee.
Standing Committee Amendment number 1, Majority Whip.
So, thank you, Mr.
Majority Whip Western, excuse me.
I
He was there
I always
first.
wanted to be whipped.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate the standing committee amendment in terms of like what it's conceptually trying to do, right? We want to use these local laborers, all that kind of stuff, give preference to Wyoming folks. Love that. My concern there lies in, if you look at 16.6.202 in the definitions, AI, it talks about the laborer means a person employed to perform unskilled or skilled manual labor for wages in any capacity and does not include independent contractors. The concern there is that this is a bill that deals with these folks who are bidding on these government contracts, whether at the municipal, county, or state level. Oftentimes, these contractors will use subcontractors, independent contractors, all that kind of stuff. So if we need to hire independent contractors to come in and do the sheetrocking, I'm worried that we are inadvertently excluding them from this process. So if I'm wrong, someone please clarify, but I think if I'm reading this correctly, I think this is an amendment that we need to defeat. Thank you.
Right, Vice Chairman Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too have my eyebrows raised just a little bit when it said because that act, the Wyoming Preference Act of 1971, as it defines, again, labor does not include an independent contractor, and then it requires that every public work can only employ Wyoming laborers, which would not include an independent contractor. Are we comfortable with that? I'm not sure that that fits the intent of what you're trying to accomplish in this bill.
Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the definition of laborer really only applies to the Wyoming Preference Act. The issue in committee was that specific section on page 2, line 20 would actually conflict with the Wyoming Preference Act if it wasn't subject to the Wyoming Preference Act. Again, this is, if you look at page 1, this is what if you look at the line 13, this is a shall not otherwise discriminate. The issue with the conflict with the Wyoming Preference Act is that the Wyoming Preference Act actually does discriminate a little bit. So we actually have to include that to make sure that we're not conflicting with law that we have already passed. Otherwise, you open the door for lawyers to go to court and see what happens.
Any further question or any further discussion on the Standing Committee Amendment number 1? Sensing an urge to vote? Question being called. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. Standing Committee Amendment number 1 has passed. Division being called. All those in favor, please rise. All opposed, please rise. More than 19. Division 1 has failed. We're back on the bill. We do have a committee of the amendment, or committee of the whole amendment. Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I would like to move Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 147 and ask for your favorable vote. And all this does, members, is if you go to the top of page 2, lines 1 through 6 is about findings. And these findings really don't say a whole lot. Typically, this body and this legislature does not include findings within our laws, and so I'm just deleting the findings. I don't feel that it detracts from the bill in any way, because the real meat of the bill is it starts on line 8 and throughout the rest of the bill. That's where the crux of it is. So by reducing the findings, again, we typically don't put those in our green books, and I think this will improve the bill without doing any damage. So please vote aye on the amendment.
Question being called. All those in favor of Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1, please say aye. All those opposed, no. Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 has passed. Division being called. All those in favor, please stand. New and improved. All those opposed, please stand. Committee, the whole amendment has passed. 33. We are back on the bill. Any further discussion, Chairman? Chairman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and I would hope that I can just get a quick answer on this. I am curious what this changes as it stands compared to current law. And only because it's my understanding that we run something very similar with current law with contracting practices. So if I can just get an understanding of what it is that we're attempting to accomplish and whether or not this is actually a major problem before I go through and cast this. Of course, I'm getting hit from both sides and I see value on both sides of the argument. I just want to know what we're actually trying to accomplish with this. Thank you.
Vice Chair Heiner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've seen many of these federal mandates that are proposed right now, but they're not actually codified, that will require or may require that these public funded projects with the Infrastructure Act will need to be through a PLA. And that's why we've got this letter with all these executive officers of various states that are opposing this. What this does is clarifies our position as a state that if there is any public money utilized from the state of Wyoming, we will not discriminate. All bidders are welcome, whether they have a PLA or not. Now recognize if it's a federal grant that is specific, for example, for the installation here in this city for the Air Force, that's all 100% federal money and it's not run through the state. So that can have PLAs. We have nothing to say about that. But if any portion of a project is administered by the state, then we can require that it be non-discriminatory and open to all bidders. So that's what this bill does, is allows us to maintain the process that we enjoy of having free and open bidding agreements. And if there needs to be a PLA, let that be decided between the contractor and his employees, not something that's mandated from the state. And
Any further discussion?
a question.
Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Zwanitser's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it does so with a recommendation that Senate File 147 do pass. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed say no. Senate File 147 has passed the Committee of the Whole. I would like to mention the general file has been updated. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 151. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 151, sponsored by Senator Hutchings, Wyoming Prescription Drug Transparency Act, an act relating to the insurance code. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 3 revenue, to whom is referred Senate File 151 engrossed, Wyoming Prescription Drug Transparency Act, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Spare, Byron, Harshman, Locke, Northrup, Oakley, Storer, Strzok, Zwanitzer. Representative Harshman, Chairman. This bill was re-referred to Committee Number 2 Appropriations. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 2 Appropriations, to whom is referred Senate File 151 engrossed, Wyoming Prescription Drug Transparency Act, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that a do pass failed in accordance with House Rule 5-4. Ayes, Representatives Sherwood, Stith, Walters, Zwanitzer. Noes, Representatives Henderson, Larson, Nicholas. Representative Nicholas, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Vice Chairman Oakley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it do so with the recommendation that Senate File 151 do pass, and I further move the adoption of Standing Committee Amendment Number 1. And then from there, Mr. Chairman, I will turn the explanation of the bill over to the good representative from House District 6, and after that, the explanation of the Standing Committee Amendment to another fellow member of our committee from House District 43.
Representative Stock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what this is we have, it's about the PBMs, which are pharmacy benefit managers. And so what's been happening is the PBMs have been charging unnecessary fees. So this bill is about that prohibits the PBMs from charging unnecessary fees, and it prohibits PBMs from recouping funds from the pharmacy after a claim is correctly processed. It increases access to health care by allowing Wyoming citizens to receive their medications from the pharmacy of their choice. It prohibits PBMs from charging a health plan a higher amount for the medication than what is reimbursed to the pharmacy, known as spread pricing. And it introduces transparency by requiring that pharmacies be allowed to receive a copy of the contracts they are subject to. It also prohibits a PBM from penalizing a pharmacy for submitting an alleged violation to the state insurance department or other government officials. And also prohibits a PBM from reimbursing a non-affiliated pharmacy at a lower rate than the PBM's affiliated pharmacy. And it also prohibits mandatory mail order. And also allows pharmacies to appeal the reimbursement of expensive brand name medication if the pharmacy is reimbursed less than their cost to acquire the medications. So what we really do have here is PBMs have taken over. They've gotten so big, they've actually been able to buy some insurance companies. And what in the end, if we don't get control of it, we are not going to have any local pharmacies, not only our hometown ones, we will actually lose our Safeways, our Walgreens, Walmart, and I'm not supposed to name names. Sorry. Anyway, we are close to only being able to have mail-in to get our drugs. So this is a very important bill, and I would be an aye on this. I ask for an aye. Thank you.
Representative Zawinetzer, Dan, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I always hope to be presenting the most complicated bill of the session at 5 o'clock on a Friday. So quickly, the backstory on some of this is PBM issues have been before the legislature for a decade. Most significant change was in 2017, where the Corporations Committee spent a year on some auditing requirements, some transparency, got legislation in our statutes. Many, I would say almost every other state that I can think of is dealing with the same issues that Wyoming is dealing with in regards to pharmacy benefit managers and the associated complexities of, well, prescription drugs. And obviously, we all know there's a lot of money to be made, and price wars happen. So what I attempted to do, and you'll see two amendments, a standing committee amendment I'm going to present was designed in a very complex, fast-moving 2-hour hearing, and I basically just took a quick chainsaw to the bill to take out everything that was superbly controversial. There's still a lot of controversial things in the bill. And then I've gone through and tried to input what I can back into the statutes, and I'm sure we'll have lots more discussion. So quickly running through the bill as quick as I can, what the standing committee amendment does, if you have the bill in front of you, it doesn't touch pages 2 or 3. First change is on page 5 in Romanet 9. We're talking about reimbursing a pharmacy for pharmacy services less than a PBM would have with an affiliated pharmacy. So the quickest way to explain this, let's think of that super expensive coffee that has stars in the cup and costs a lot of bucks. So we'll call it Astro Coffee. So they have a large share of the market. They distribute to their own stores. They distribute to other stores that aren't named what they are named, but they're still owned by, but they're, you're not supposed to know that that company actually owns them because they're independent coffee shops. And then they can sell to other, what you'd see in your local, around town, your local independent coffee shops, et cetera. Same thing with this section. It's going after trying to force that what you sell internally to your own stores is the same as what you'd sell to anybody else in the open market. And I just think that's a bad business practice, so I took it out. We additionally took out subsection B on the bottom of page 5 at this time when it comes to incentivizing and cost drivers. And so how these PBM works, I'm certainly not trying to protect PBMs, but I am trying to protect, the open market. And when you affect the open market and you give money somewhere else, it comes from someone else. And most of the time with this bill, it's going to come from higher insurance premiums in the private market. So I tried to take this part out when it talks about these incentivized programs. When you buy in bulk with economies of scale, that saves money, right? It just does. So took that part out. Following down, we did allow on page 6 in Romanet A, left most of the language, but took out appeals. We still allowed the pharmacy to investigate and resolve disputes with a PBM and a pharmacy, took out the appeal process that they could appeal across the board because that's where a lot of these expenses are going to come in. Page 7 took out MAC redefinition, so maximum allowable cost. Super complex, most important cost driver in the entire bill is what the maximum reimbursement you can get for one of these currently generic drugs. They took out the word generic drugs, and so that would add all specialties, which are much more expensive. Huge point of contention. Probably the most important point of contention in the bill is MAC pricing and how we define it. Moving on page 9, we also took out the definition of specialty medication because that definition, I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but it's not a good definition in my mind. Our state agencies asked on page 10 to delete the definition of spread pricing and move Medicaid, Medicare, and workers' comp out of the bill because it is so extremely expensive. They were in the bill. Our Medicaid program would see another $50 or $70 million. So we're not hurting any of our workers' comp or Medicaid because they're exempted now and they want to stay exempted because that benefits. I would mention that employer group insurance of the state for our state employees is still affected. Some states have taken that out, but we have not done so yet. Running through the rest of the standing committee amendment, I think that leaves in everything else on badge pricing. And then the only other thing is our good friends down the hall. We talked about where to appropriate the money for this new position and where to get the money for our kind of beefing up our program in the Department of Insurance. They wanted to take it out of the special funds, revenue funds from our Department of Insurance. Those come from assessments on our insurance companies. Didn't think it was fair personally to make our insurance companies pay for this. It should come out of general funds. That's the standing committee amendment. Would ask for your favorable consideration.
We are on standing committee amendment number 1, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to bring up a couple of things. I was a no on the vast majority of these amendments that led to the committee of the whole amendment. I will tell you that there are some small nuggets in there, and I think that we should probably return to this amendment in future readings, but I'm going to ask that you resist this amendment right now. And I just want to explain a little bit of the background. We have a bit of a Goliath versus David situation here, and Goliath is the corporations that are trying to vertically integrate, which means they're purchasing the corporations below them and above them and making a supply chain in which they control the entire market. Governments for a long time in this country, in an effort to protect free markets, have developed laws to avoid monopolies. And really that's what this bill does. But the amendment unfortunately weakens that potential opportunity. And spread pricing, which is eliminated in this amendment, is one of the most important pieces of creating transparency so that all people in the market can see what is happening with this large corporation that is really running the whole show. If their pricing and the way that they are funding their own corporations as well as funding the outsiders, our small pharmacies, if that's transparent, then the market is much more open and free. And that's what this bill does. So I urge a no vote on the amendment and an aye vote on the bill.
Majority Whip Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some concerns with this amendment. That's basically because what it does is it really just takes the teeth out of the bill. It guts it entirely. And I think my concern comes back to really the entire predicament of our healthcare system, right? We all know that at a broad level, it's in pretty rough shape. A lot of room for improvement. I think it starts at the PBM level. If we talk about just the business model of how this works, right? The entire healthcare system is there to do two things: improve healthcare outcomes at the lowest price possible, the lowest cost possible. I mean, that's really it. We talk about the pharmaceutical companies that actually make the drugs. They're an important part of this value chain. The researchers, the scientists that actually develop the drugs, that's really important, right? That knowledge power and the ones that actually manufacture it. Let's talk about the other end of this value chain, the pharmacies. They're really important and needed in this whole value chain because they make sure that the medication gets dispensed properly, the right amounts. These pharmacists, the pharmacology classes they go through are very intense, very rigorous, and they're really needed to ensure those healthcare outcomes. And again, the third component is the insurance companies, right? To keep those costs low, to ensure that no one's getting us paying too much out of this. In this entire model, I appreciate what some folks think PBMs do, but are they truly necessary in this value chain to improve healthcare outcomes and to ensure they do so at the lowest price possible. I mean, just by the sheer mechanics of it, right? If there's a fourth party in this entire value chain, it's inherently going to add more costs. Again, that's fine if we can be convinced that they actually derive those two things, lower costs for care and better healthcare outcomes. So I think in principle, that's what we're trying to do here, right? A lot of different problems in our healthcare system. This component, this value cycle, this value chain that this bill deals with is certainly a really big one. And so that's why I'm really having a hard time voting for the standing committee amendment, because it completely removes the ability to do that. Those rebates, all those things, to move that value back into those first three components of the value chain, those first three participants. I mean, so long as it's structured properly and those benefits, those rebates, that value gets recaptured to the pharmacies, the insurance company, the pharmaceuticals, and of course, the person who's insured, the patient. I think you can capture a lot more of that revenue. I understand there's some technical stuff with, our department that deals with healthcare plans for our state employees. I think that can be worked through, but I think in concept, it's something that we need to do. If we are interested in really fixing our healthcare problems, I think this is a step in the right direction. So that's why I would urge no vote on the amendment. Thank you.
Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We've heard a lot about pharmacies. We've talked a lot about hospitals. We've heard it all. But without this amendment, let me preface my remarks by saying this. Wyoming has one of the highest healthcare costs in the nation. By adding this, you're going to increase that to potentially number one or number two, as already mentioned previously, $45 million. As I mentioned, we're talking about pharmacies here. We talked about providers, all those different things. But I want you to remember, without this amendment, those that aren't in this room, the remaining employees in the state of Wyoming that are respectively working their tails off, you're going to add $26 to $36 a month to their health care costs. Think about that. Without this amendment, you're going to add $26 to $36 more a month to their costs for health insurance. Look, diesel's going up, eggs are going up, milk's going up. Do we need to burden them further with another $26 to $36 a month on top of what they're already paying? Representatives, I urge you and strongly support this amendment favorably, because if not, you're going to put the detriment on the employees that aren't here to representing themselves, but are representing themselves to me and others. $26 to $36 a month. Keep that in mind. Thank you.
Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I missed it, but can there be some conversation on how much the bill itself would cost the state of Wyoming? Because I know the state of Wyoming also deals with drugs and buying drugs, as well as what it would look like with the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to clarify some things. The statement that said that it was going to increase costs to the public is not accurate. What this does is it increases the transparency of insurance, of PBMs, of pharmacies, of on the equal ground, Well, this doesn't increase cost. It prevents price gouging. It prevents abusive practices by these PBMs. That's what this bill does. It doesn't touch cost. It doesn't remove PBMs from the process. It just brings transparency to the system. So I want to clear that up. This bill is needed for our rural pharmacies without this amendment. This amendment guts the ability for us to help our independent pharmacies. So I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Representative Pinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the claim that many will make against the changes against the bill is that this will, the PBM save healthcare a huge amount of money. But the reality is that what PBMs do is they require or they underpay pharmacies for the prescriptions that they're dispensing. So what happens with our rural independently owned pharmacies is then they can't afford help, which increases their ability to provide care to the patients, increases the safety as one person is trying to do many jobs. I've had contact with pharmacists who have said that they're having to cash in to keep their pharmacy doors open. They're cashing in their 401ks. They're taking out second mortgages to keep these businesses open to serve their communities. If these pharmacies close in many of the communities in this state, the next option is 70 miles away. And so given our Wyoming winters, you know, we have elderly people driving 70 miles to pick up their prescriptions. For myself, treating people in an urgent care situation, add on top of that we're not just talking about their regularly, you know, medications that maybe they could get through mail order. We're talking about patients who are now sick and possibly elderly or suffering in some way and having to drive an hour in Wyoming weather to try to pick up their urgent medications. What PBMs do is another thing that they do is they force these pharmacies to buy specific medications or specific brands of medications, which may not be cheaper because ultimately the PBM ends up getting a kickback. So I had contact, as I said, with a pharmacy just today that they gave an example that they had today. Actually, I have a couple of examples from a couple different pharmacists. They said one patient, an elderly patient, came in to pick up their insulin, and this particular insulin is available for $40, but the PBM requires that they have the $500 insulin. Another pharmacist that reached out to me in support of the engrossed version of the bill said that today for one patient, they filled 4 prescriptions. Of those 4, they made money on one of them. They made 51 cents. The other 3 prescriptions that they dispensed, they lost $212. So these are the things that this bill is attempting to remedy. This is a big deal for our state, and I would urge you to resist the standing committee amendment and vote aye on the bill.
Representative Rodriguez-Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the standing committee amendment. Folks, we have to fight for our independent pharmacies. They do so much for our community, and the relationship that we can have with these pharmacists are really invaluable. They take the time to talk to our elderly. They have extreme patience. They open the door in these small towns that they'll stay after hours. I can go on and on about what they do for our communities. You don't get that personalized attention when you receive pharmaceuticals through the mail. I'd hate to see communities lose these local mom and pop pharmacists, independent pharmacists that do so much. On and against.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So certainly not my favorite moment to come up here and try to defend the free market and practices that are kind of shady. No argument. But let me walk you back and we'll talk about the last year because this was an interim topic for corporations. We've had 3 meetings, got everybody together, open meetings, worked on legislation, everybody agreed, pharmacists walked away a week later. Then they testified in committee, oh, well, maybe it was an okay bill as a starting point. They didn't like what we worked on all summer. They brought their own bill. There's a full court press. And I appreciate the emotion that's driving this. I really do. But you don't get to pass on $45 million to the private insurance market without a little bit of consideration that maybe this bill goes a bit too far. So let me just mention a couple of things. Your rural pharmacies had a proposal. Colorado protects their rural pharmacies, right? Up to 10,000 people. They have protectionism. It's great. They didn't want that, right? That was discussed at the first meeting. That bill was a no-go to protect just the independent rural pharmacies. Didn't happen. Now, what else do I want to talk about real quick? PBMs. It's not required. It's a choice. People use them because they think they work and save money. I don't know if they do or not, but people aren't forced to use them. You can go through your private insurer, right? This is all about economies of scale and how quickly you can get a large amount of drugs and you get kickbacks and you get rebates. I understand that. We talked about mail. I appreciate that that will drive up the prices, but on the committee of the whole amendment I'm bringing next, we'll put that back in. And this moves the ball down the field, right? You want to push this bill without any amendments? Well, it's interesting because you have 4 more amendments coming, and some of them are the exact copies of the amendments in the standing committee and the committee of the whole. But I'm not trying to hurt the bill. I'm trying to move the issue down the field because I'm telling you, this isn't making it to the field goal touchdown line in its current form. So I'd appreciate your agreement on the standing committee amendments. We can certainly have discussions on second and third reading. On certain sections that are taken out, we can put more in. There's a lot to talk about that's not at 5:20 on a Friday, but I'd like to have this as a starting point. But we can do it the other way. We can kill this, and I'll bring 9 amendments on second reading, and we can talk about every facet of PBMs, if that's what you wish to do. But I think it's easier to start with the first 2 amendments, and then we can have more in-depth conversations as we move along.
Representative Stivar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the amendment. Last 2 years, I sat on Labor Health, and we went over this extremely with the pharmacists, with the PBMs. We need to protect our small mom and pop pharmacies. Thank you.
Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I haven't spoken much this week, and so I was feeling kind of lonely, and I hadn't really gotten a chance to get up here and be comfortable. But the good chairman of Labor, I think he caught my interest when he said I started out working on this amendment with a chainsaw. And I would argue that I'm against the amendment and for the bill. I don't know that there's not maybe some things to be tweaked, perhaps, but there's time for that on second or third reading. When you take a chainsaw and you start out at the very beginning on a bill, I don't know how many of you tracked in but somewhere along the line, the sound of the chainsaw kept me from being able to concentrate on tracking all of that in. And so I would argue that we should probably not accept this amendment, and let's work on this on second or third reading.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick note here. We have many small pharmacies, in fact, Many State, maybe 1, if not 2, over in the southwest corner. This is not about sacrificing them for the better good. This is not a bait and switch or robbing Peter to pay Paul. What it is I'm telling you, it's on the back of the people who are working here. Without this, we're going to straddle them again, as I mentioned, up to $36 a month. But if you don't believe me, and that's fair, and that's your opportunity and your prerogative, reach out to your county commissioners. Ask them about this. Ask your independent employees, et cetera. We're hurting the people that have built this state by undertaking this. I didn't use the word chainsaw. Is this bill perfect? It's not, nor is the amendment. This whole thing is not. But we got to make progress to reduce the amount of burden we're placing on our respective employees. I can't overemphasize. We're hurting our employees by passing this. And if we want to sacrifice the thousands of employees for the hundreds of pharmacists, you can view it that. But there's a way to work through this. As mentioned already, second and third reading amendments. But let's get this moving forward because we're burdening and strapping the shoulder of this whole deal on top of the people who built this country.
Representative Winters.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Folks, I have 2 of these pharmacies in my district, and they tell me that they're losing up to $10,000 a month because of this problem. So we don't need this amendment. Thank you.
Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill has been back. It's like, what's that day, yeah. Let's get this thing through second reading and beat the heck out of it on, the other one. I mean, through committee of the whole, sorry. I just, listen, these 2 amendments that we've been hitting for the last 20 or so minutes, they make the bill work. If you want to talk about this bill again next year and have that day again, well, then just keep putting amendments on it because you're killing it with the amendments. So I'd please ask you to seriously consider all of those good bills that everybody's been working on. They're down the list. And maybe let's move this one forward. I am for this amendment, and I'm not there yet on the bill without it.
Any further discussion? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a philosophical comment. A free market does not exist in the presence of monopolies. I'm on and against this amendment.
Any further discussion? Question being called. All those in favor of Standing Committee Amendment number 1, please say aye. All opposed say no. Standing Committee Amendment number 1 has failed. Division being called. All those in favor, please stand. All those opposed, please stand. Standing Committee Amendment number 1 has failed, 34 to 27. 27-31, excuse me. We are back on the bill. We do have Committee of the Whole amendments. If there's no further discussion, Chairman Zwanitzer.
I would respectfully withdraw Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 at this time because it doesn't work without the Standing Committee Amendment.
We are Committee of the Whole Amendment number 2.
Oh, shoot, what do I say again?
Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully withdraw Committee of the Whole Amendment number 2 to Senate File number 151.
We are on Committee of the Whole Amendment number 3, Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully withdraw Committee Amendment number 3 for Senate File 151.
We are on Committee Amendment number 4, Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully withdraw Committee of the Whole Amendment number 4 to Senate File number 151.
We are on Committee of the Whole Amendment number 5, Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully withdraw Committee of the Whole Amendment number 5 to Senate File number 151.
We are back on the bill. Any further discussion? Question being called. All those in favor of co-chairman, or vice chairman, excuse me, Oakley's motion, the Committee of the Whole rises to report to do so with the recommendation that Senate File 151 do pass. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. Senate File 151 has passed the Committee of the Whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 108. The reading clerk will read the bill.
Senate File 108, sponsored by Senator Nethercott. Court reporter fees, district court discretion, an act relating to courts. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 1 Judiciary, to whom is referred Senate File 108 engrossed, court reporter fees, district court discretion, respect the report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Chestick, Crago, Haroldson, Nemec, Oakley, Providenza, Rodriguez-Williams, Washit. Noes, Representative Jennings. Representative Washit, Chairman.
You have heard the reading of the bill. What's your pleasure, Chairman Washit?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it do so with recommendation that Senate File 108 do pass. And I turn over explanation of the bill to the representative in the microphone.
Oh, Representative Nemec.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, let's do a good bill now. I bring you Senate File 108, and I ask for your favorable consideration. What this does, it allows the, let me get this right, the District Court Judicial Conference to set the per-page transcription fees for our court reporters. In the state of Wyoming right now, I believe we have 3 openings, and we can't get them filled because one thing these court reporters look at is that per-page fee that they're going to be getting for doing these transcripts. And if you need to know what they are, just ask me the question. I'll do it. Well, I'll stand for any questions for you.
Mr. Speaker Pro Tem Stiff.
Chairman Zwanitzer, on and against Senate File 108, there are 2 problems with it. One is it delegates away our authority to set fees to a judicial conference. Okay, so that's a problem. We don't typically do that. The other problem with it is this, it pretends that technology doesn't exist. And basically, court reporting is being done the same way it was done 50 years ago, and they're getting paid by per page. When you sit in your committee meetings downstairs, you'll notice that on the screen, there is a real-time transcript that shows up, right? And no one's getting paid by the page to do that. We need this whole sector of our economy, so to speak, this court reporting segment is ripe for change and disruption. And if we do this, what we're doing is we're telling them that technology doesn't matter. You can continue doing things the same way as before. Our official court reporters, they make a base salary of about $60,000 a year, a little over $60,000 a year. That's their base salary, okay? For criminal trials, they have to do the court reporting. They don't get paid any extra for that. This fee relates to civil transcripts. When you do a trial, and then if the parties want a transcript, they request it, and then they get charged by the page. It is true that the per page fee has not gone up for a long time. So it is true that their inflation adjusted real wages have gone down. So I want to admit that. If they're using the same technology, and that's my question, is instead of just passing it off and pretending like the industry hasn't changed, what we should really be doing is looking into how do we make this whole system more efficient? Because the fact is that court reporting is going to go the way of travel agents, right? It's going to become a profession that's going to look very different 10 years from now, or at least should look very different in my view, because frankly, you shouldn't need a court reporter. You should have, if you've got good audio, good voice transcript technology. So it shouldn't take as long to create a page of transcript today as it did in 1985. That's my point. And I think this bill just pretends that the technology is going to be the same. So I think both because we're delegating away our own responsibility and because it ignores the changes in technology, I think this bill's not ready for prime time. It is a matter that perhaps the judiciary should consider in the interim. Thank you.
Chairman Washut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Originally, I wasn't in favor of this bill either. And as I heard testimony in committee, what became apparent was that something like 21 years since the last time these fees for per page production were increased. And in my estimation, that's legislative neglect. If we're going to put these kinds of things in statute, the legislature has to be more attentive to keeping them current than to simply let them languish for 21 years. I do believe that the Judicial Conference will be more attentive to these needs. I also think the Judicial Conference will be cautious about raising the fees inordinately. But I do think that it's a wise choice. Move this over to the judicial branch that will pay closer attention to it and not neglect it for the next 21 years.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this was a bill that I initially went into the meeting thinking I was going to vote no on, but it made all sense in the world once we went through it. Court reporters, while they pay for their own equipment, I don't think it's necessarily an efficiency problem that we have. You know, the system, I think how we pay court reporters maybe needs to systemically change at some point, but right now this is what happens across the country. So changing that is going to be potentially an overhaul. And so when we talk about, you know, why put it in with the district court conference? I mean, we could raise the fee and we could have everybody vote to increase that fee, which puts a burden, which could put a further burden, because we're going to go another 21 years before we change it. So then they're going to ask for a larger increase, whereas right now they want 60 cents. But they want to be able to do it without having to force this legislature to have to vote for, okay, we're going to raise it 60 cents right now. Then the next year we're going to come back. And what that ends up coming to is $64,000 more a year, pretty inconsequential when we get to what this service actually is. So your court reporter is your beacon of transparency in the court. It's how you can appeal for civil cases. And for criminal cases, it's not out of the, you know, if somebody can't afford the transcript, they don't have to pay for it. In civil cases, they often do pro bono work. So these folks aren't getting super wealthy. They're just asking to make sure that they can get good people in these positions. Because do you want a bad court reporter if you end up having to appeal a case? No, you want a good court reporter. Yeah, so it's our surrounding states have much higher rates, and you know, the equipment issue, it isn't just the only thing. They also have to get help with doing these, because oftentimes attorneys will come at 5 o'clock and say, I need this transcript, or they'll come in the afternoon and they get it that night. I don't know any other fairies that fly around and can do those magic tricks. I certainly can't. So it's 5 something on a Friday. This is a good bill. Let's not beat it to death, please. Thank you.
Representative Chesak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and for the bill. I was in the Judicial Committee. We heard the testimony from the court reporters to the Speaker Pro Tem's comment. Yes, there is new technology out there that does transcription. You've seen it on the bottoms of your screens in these hearings when the transcripts come out pretty garbled. It's not good transcription. It's really hard to understand what there's being said sometimes. There's misspellings. Names aren't spelled correctly. It can't keep up with the way people talk. Having a court reporter in the room telling you to slow down, speak more clearly, ask for spellings, those kinds of things make your transcripts better. And that's something you should pay for. And I think they should be paid for doing that work. They do good work. I was a trial lawyer for 20 years before I went into academia. And I don't know how many depositions I took, how many trials I had. And almost all the time they were fantastic. The court reporters generally do a very good job, but a bad court reporter can kill your appeal. I had that happen to me when there was a trial in a smaller town. The court transcript was awful. It was useless. It made the case unappealable because the record there were major gaps and things were missing. It was just a horrible transcript. We don't want bad court reporters. We want good court reporters. We need good court reporters. And if you're going to get a good court reporter, you need to pay them well. You need to pay them what they're worth, and they're worth a lot. So I am very much in support of this bill, and I urge your aye vote.
Vice Chair Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I know that you've heard some of this, but I just want you to conceptualize this. I completely disagree with the characterization by the city lawyer. I don't think it was on point, to be honest. But so you've got your judicial branch, and they work with their court reporters so closely. It's like a team. We probably have like 20 something, and the court reporters and the judges. I'll carefully say that they came to us. Let us have this within our control. It's what we do. And right now we're currently 3 short. We know that we just got some new district court judges as approved by this body because there's so much work. If we don't have court reporters, we cannot have court. Hard stop. We are required to have these transcripts for court proceedings. So this creates an efficiency in the system so that the court reporter can work with the judge, which is what they do every day. So just please vote aye.
Any further discussion? Question being called. All those in, whoops. No. Question being called. All those in favor of Chairman Wash's motion with the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it does so with the recommendation that Senate File 108 do pass. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. Senate File 108 has passed the Committee of the Whole. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the Committee of the Whole rise and report.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The motion carries.
The reading clerk will read the Committee of the Whole report.
Mr. Speaker, your Committee of the Whole, having had under consideration bills on general file, begs leave to report as follows. Senate Joint Resolution 5, do pass. Senate File 83, do pass amended. Senate File 80, do pass amended. Senate File 146, do pass amended. Senate File 174, do pass amended. Senate File 112, do pass. Senate File 147, do pass amended. Senate File 151, do pass. Senate File 108, do pass. Representative Zwanitzer Dave, Chairman.
I move that the adoption of the Committee of the Whole report.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. Motion carries. Congratulations, Representative Zwanitzer Dave. All right, reports from standing committees.
Senate File 127, sponsored by Blockchain, Wyoming Stable Token Act, an act relating to trade and commerce. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 7, Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions, to whom is referred Senate File 127 engrossed, Wyoming Stable Token Act, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Chadwick, Harshman, Newsom, Olson, Wiley, Yin. Noes, Representatives Haroldson, Knapp, Ottman. Representative Olson, Chairman. Senate File 133, sponsored by Senator Schuler, Student Eligibility in Interscholastic Sports, an act relating to education. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 4, Education, to whom was referred Senate File 133 engrossed, Student Eligibility in Interscholastic Sports, respectfully report same back to the House with the recommendation that do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Andrew, Berger, Clauston, Lawley, Northrup. Noes, Representatives Allred, Brown, Obermuller, Provenza. Representative Northrup, Chairman.
Re-referral, Chairman Northrup. Senate File Number 133.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to re-refer Senate File 133 to your Committee Number 2, Appropriations.
Without objection, Senate File 133 is re-referred to Committee Number 2, Appropriations. Chief, does that clear the deck?
Mr. Speaker, I also have a re-referral.
Oh,
Yep. I'd
Chairman
like
Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to re-refer Senate File 127 to Committee Number 2, Appropriations.
Without objection, Senate File 127 is re-referred to Committee Number 2, Appropriations. Messages from the Senate.
Message 429. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 276, Shed Antlers and Horns Conservation Stamp. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 16, noes 12, excused 3. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 431. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 103, Political Party Affiliation Declaration and Changes. Ayes 19, noes 11, excused 1. Message 432. Mr. Speaker, the Senate adopted the Committee of the Whole report, failing the bill listed below by the vote indicated. House Bill 270, Improvement and Service Districts Limitations. Ayes 10, noes 16, excused 5. The bill has been indefinitely postponed. Message 433. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 9, Juvenile Courts, Concurrent Jurisdiction Clarification. The Senate adopted the Joint Conference Committee Number 1 report on the bill listed above by the vote indicated. Ayes 27, excused 4. Sincerely, Ellen Thompson, Senate Chief Clerk.
Chief, does that clear the deck? So those last two bills, those are the last two bills that came out of standing committees, and they're both referred to appropriations. So the appropriations will be able to hear those, and they will be, provided they, whatever they do, and then those bills will be back available to the body probably after noon on Monday. So they would still be available for debate on general file if the majority floor leader so chooses. So, Mr. Majority Floor Leader?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the House adjourn until Monday, the 27th day of February, 2023.
Committee announcements, that would be Chairman Nicholas, I think, is the last one left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your House Appropriations will meet at noon to hear on re-referrals for 136, 133, 127. Did I miss one?
What's that? Chairman?
133, 136, 127. Are there any others? Or on re-referral?
133.
130, yeah, I've got that one.
136 and 127, I believe.
Okay. At noon.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee number 10, Labor, Health, and Social Services, will meet on Monday at 8 a.m. with a like-minded committee from the Senate to discuss interim topics in Senate Room 6.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader, do you need to fix that motion?
I do need to adjust that. 10 a.m. is when we will meet again, Monday, the 27th day of February.
You have heard the Majority Floor Leader's motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The House stands adjourned until 10 a.m., February 27th, 2023.